Hey Dead Signal FM viewers, getting ready for bed? Wishing you a calm and cozy night. Before we start, where are you watching from and what time is it? Let's get started. The assignment seemed simple enough. Document the architectural features of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital before its scheduled demolition next month. As a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned structures, I developed a reputation for capturing the haunting beauty of forgotten places. This job was right in my wheelhouse. A once prestigious medical facility shuttered for nearly 30 years after a series of budget cuts and mysterious patient deaths. Just get in, take your photos, and get out before dark. My contact at the Historical Society had instructed, sliding a rusted key across the table. The electricity was cut decades ago, and the structure isn't entirely sound. The West Wing suffered water damage in the floods of '98. I arrived at St. Augustine just after noon on a Tuesday, parking my car at the overgrown entrance. The building loomed against a slate-gray sky, its Victorian facade somehow both majestic and menacing. Weathered stone, blackened with decades of pollution, rose 5 stories. Broken windows stared out like empty eye sockets. The surrounding grounds had given way to nature's reclamation. Tangled vines crawling up crumbling walls, weeds forcing their way through cracked concrete paths. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, plastered with faded "No trespassing" signs. I unlatched the gate with the key I'd been given, wincing at the metallic shriek as I pushed it open. The sound echoed across the empty grounds, startling a murder of crows from their perch on a nearby dead tree. They took flight with indignant caws, circling once before disappearing into the clouded sky. I shouldered my camera bag and tightened the straps of my backpack. Inside were the essentials: extra batteries, flashlights, energy bars, water, and a detailed floor plan of the hospital. The air around me felt unusually still, heavy with approaching rain. I checked my watch, 12:37 p.m., plenty of time before sunset. The main entrance featured massive wooden doors, their ornate carvings obscured beneath layers of graffiti. The key worked smoothly despite its aged appearance, and the left door swung inward with surprising ease. No resistance, no scraping against warped floorboards. It was as if the hospital had been expecting me. The entrance hall smelled exactly as I'd anticipated, the universal scent of abandonment. Musty air thick with dust, mildew from water damage, the faint chemical tang of old cleaning solutions, and underneath it all, something vaguely organic. Rot, perhaps, or the lingering ghost of antiseptic from its operational days. Light filtered through the dirt-caked windows, revealing a once grand reception area. A curved desk dominated the center of the room, its wooden surface split and warped. Behind it, a wall of small cubbies that must have once held patient files. The marble floor was cracked and stained, littered with fallen ceiling tiles and what appeared to be old medical forms. Their text faded beyond legibility. I raised my camera and began to work, moving methodically through the entrance hall, capturing the play of light across deteriorating grandeur. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, a hollow sound that seemed to travel further than it should. For 30 minutes, I worked in peaceful concentration, the familiar routine of adjusting settings, framing shots, and documenting decay. The entrance hall gave way to a central corridor that branched in 3 directions. According to my map, the East Wing had housed administrative offices and staff quarters. The central hallway led to what had once been emergency services and general patient rooms. The West Wing, the water-damaged section, had contained the operating theaters and, on its upper floors, the psychiatric ward. I decided to start with the East Wing, saving the potentially hazardous West section for last, if time permitted. The hallway narrowed as I proceeded, ceiling height dropping slightly. The floor here was linoleum rather than marble, curling up at the edges where moisture had seeped beneath it. Closed doors lined both sides, most bearing nameplates too corroded to read. The first office I entered had been thoroughly ransacked, likely by scavengers looking for anything of value. Filing cabinets lay on their sides, drawers pulled out and emptied. A heavy wooden desk remained, however, too cumbersome to steal. In one corner, Rain damage had caused the ceiling to partially collapse, revealing electrical wiring and pipework. As I photographed the room's dilapidation, a sound came from somewhere deeper in the building, a soft, shuffling noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening intently. Urban exploration had taught me to distinguish between the natural sounds of a decaying building and signs of human presence. This was neither. After 30 seconds of perfect silence, I attributed it to settling timbers or perhaps a small animal. I continued working my way through the east wing, documenting peeling paint in mesmerizing patterns, moss growing on interior walls where water had seeped through, and the stark contrast of medical posters, faded but still visible, advertising the symptoms of tuberculosis and proper hand-washing techniques. In what had once been a staff break room, I found a calendar still hanging on the wall, frozen in June 1994, the month before the hospital closed. Time slipped away as I worked. When I checked my watch again, it was already 2:53 p.m. The quality of light had changed, taking on the golden hue of late afternoon. If I wanted to cover the entire building before sunset, I needed to move more quickly. The central hallway proved more visually interesting. Here were the remnants of patient care, gurneys rusted to immobility, wheelchair parts scattered like dismembered limbs, and one room still neatly arranged with an ancient hospital bed, its mattress disintegrated into a powdery mess. The walls in this section had been a pale institutional green, now mottled with black mold in sprawling patterns that resembled Rorschach tests. I just finished photographing a nurse's station when the temperature abruptly dropped. The change was so sudden and pronounced that I could see my breath clouding before me. Hospital buildings were notorious for temperature fluctuations. I reminded myself, large spaces with inconsistent insulation created natural cold spots. Still, the hairs on my arms stood on end. A soft noise caught my attention, the distinct sound of footsteps, light and measured, moving on the floor above me. I tilted my head, listening more carefully. Surely I wasn't alone here, perhaps another photographer or an inspector from the demolition company. The footsteps continued for approximately 10 seconds before stopping. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the cold air. "Is someone there?" No response came, just the distant drip of water from somewhere unseen. I decided to investigate the upper floor, if only to confirm I was sharing the space with another urban explorer. The central staircase had a surprising elegance to it, wide steps of granite sweeping upward in a gentle curve. The banister, though coated in dust, retained hints of its original brass finish. As I ascended, I noticed the temperature returning to normal, my breath no longer visible. The second floor mirrored the layout of the first, though with smaller patient rooms designed for longer stays. Many doors stood partially open, revealing identical arrangements of bed frames and bedside tables. Other doors were firmly closed, some even sealed with heavy chains, presumably rooms containing hazardous materials or structural dangers. I walked the length of the corridor, listening for any sound of movement. Nothing. No footsteps, no shuffling, no signs of another living soul. Yet the distinct feeling of being watched intensified with each step. I turned several times, certain I would catch a glimpse of someone ducking into a doorway, but the hallway behind me remained empty. In one room, larger than the others, I found what appeared to have been a children's ward. Faded cartoon characters danced across peeling walls, smiling animals playing musical instruments, their cheerful expressions now sinister with decay. Someone had arranged rusty bed parts in the center of the room in a rough circle. Vandals, most likely, or perhaps homeless people seeking shelter. The arrangement bothered me enough that I quickly took my photos and moved on. By 4:18 p.m., the light was fading rapidly. Outside, clouds had thickened, hastening the approach of darkness. I should have headed back to the entrance, satisfied with what I'd captured. Instead, curiosity pulled me toward the west wing, the damaged section, the psychiatric ward. Something about the quality of silence from that direction drew me forward, a vacuum waiting to be filled. The double doors separating the central section from the west wing were chained shut, a faded warning sign declaring the area structurally unsound. I should have turned back. I knew that, Yet I found myself retrieving bolt cutters from my backpack, a tool I carried for precisely such obstacles. The chain parted with a dull, snapping sound that echoed far longer than it should have. As soon as I stepped through those doors, the atmosphere changed. The air grew noticeably thicker, laced with a cloying sweetness I couldn't identify. Not antiseptic, not mold, something more organic. The corridor before me appeared darker than it should have been, given the time of day and the presence of windows. It was as if the light itself hesitated to enter. The water damage was immediately evident. The ceiling sagged in multiple places, dark stains spreading across its surface like bruises. The walls bore watermarks nearly 6 feet high, testament to the severe flooding mentioned by my contact. The floor squished slightly underfoot, the linoleum hiding what I assumed was rotting subfloor. I moved cautiously, testing each step before committing my weight. The first few rooms I encountered were unremarkable, standard patient rooms with the expected decay. Then I found the stairwell to the upper floors and the psychiatric ward. Unlike the elegant central staircase, this was a utilitarian construction of concrete and metal. Some primal instinct urged me to turn back, to be content with the photos I'd already taken. I silenced it. 3 more floors waited above, and the unique documentation opportunity they represented. The stairwell was unexpectedly dry, protected somehow from the water damage evident elsewhere. My footsteps echoed sharply as I climbed, the sound bouncing between concrete walls. At the 3rd floor landing, I paused. A strange sound drifted down from above, rhythmic and faint, like labored breathing. In, out, in, out. I told myself it must be wind finding its way through broken windows, but the air within the stairwell remained perfectly still. The door to the 3rd floor was marked Psychiatric Intensive Care in faded lettering. It opened with surprising ease, no scraping or resistance. Beyond lay a circular desk, the nurse's station, surrounded by rooms arranged in a ring. Unlike the lower floors, these doors were solid metal with small observation windows set at eye level. Many rooms still had names written on small chalkboards mounted beside their doors, the writing long since faded to ghostly smudges. Unlike the open patient rooms below, these had been designed for containment, for control. I moved among them, photographing the empty spaces where troubled minds had once been housed. Some rooms contained nothing but a bare metal bed frame bolted to the floor. Others held additional restraint systems, leather straps dangling from bedsides, brackets for securing patients during treatment. In one room, someone had scratched a message into the wall beside the bed. The lettering was crude but legible. IT watches from the ceiling. I raised my gaze instinctively to the water-stained tiles overhead. Nothing but decay and spider webs. As I continued my circuit of the ward, the light outside dimmed further. I checked my watch, 5:07 p.m. Sunset would be around 6:30, but in this weather, darkness would come sooner. I should leave, I knew that. Yet something compelled me to climb higher, to see what the 4th floor held. The breathing sound grew more pronounced in the stairwell, a wet, laborious rhythm that seemed to fill the entire space. No longer could I pretend it was merely wind. It had a presence, an intentionality that raised gooseflesh on my arms. Still, I continued upward, my curiosity overwhelming my growing unease. The 4th floor was labeled simply Special Procedures. The door here was heavier than the others, requiring my full weight to push it open. It yielded with a low groan that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. The floor plan here differed from those below. A wide central hallway stretched before me, doors spaced at irregular intervals. The ceiling was higher, accommodating what appeared to be an elaborate ventilation system, metal ducts running the length of the corridor, now sagging and rusted. The breathing sound was clearer here, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The rooms on this floor were larger, clearly designed for procedures rather than housing. In one, I found a rusted hydrotherapy tub, massive and industrial, with restraint points along its rim. Another contained what could only have been an electroshock therapy setup, a reclining chair with straps, surrounded by the decayed remains of electrical equipment. My camera flash illuminated these relics of primitive psychiatric treatment, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The building had grown almost completely dark now, forcing me to use my flashlight continuously. Its beam seemed weaker than it should have been, struggling to penetrate the unnatural gloom. In the largest room at the end of the hall, I discovered what must have been the operating theater. Elevated observation seats surrounded a central depression where a surgical table still stood, its stainless steel surface the only thing in the building untouched by rust or decay. Above it, a complex arrangement of lights hung from a track system in the ceiling, designed to illuminate the patient from all angles. As I photographed this eerily preserved scene, the breathing sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute, no dripping water, no settling building, no distant traffic from beyond the hospital grounds. Just complete, suffocating stillness. Then came a new sound, a faint scratching, like fingernails on plaster, coming from somewhere inside the walls. It moved, tracing a path around the operating theater, circling me. I stood frozen, flashlight beam fixed on the surgical table, as the scratching completed a full circuit of the room before falling silent. I should leave. Now, the thought was a screaming alarm in my head. I turned toward the door, only to find it closed. I was certain I had left it open. With 3 quick strides, I crossed to the door and grasped the handle. It turned easily in my hand, but the door itself wouldn't budge, as if immense pressure were being applied from the other side. I pulled harder, bracing one foot against the wall for leverage. Nothing. The scratching resumed, no longer confined to the walls. It came from the ceiling now, directly above the surgical table. I raised my flashlight, illuminating a spreading stain that hadn't been there moments before, a dark, viscous fluid seeping through the ceiling tiles. A drop fell, landing on the stainless steel with an audible pat. Then another. Within seconds, the fluid was dripping steadily, forming a small pool on the surgical table. The liquid was too dark to be water, too thick. It moved strangely, seeming to pulse in rhythm with the breathing sound that had now returned, louder than before. The temperature plummeted again, so rapidly that it stole my breath. Frost began forming on the surgical table, spreading outward from the pool of dark liquid. The breathing grew louder still, no longer sounding as if it came from somewhere in the building. It was in the room with me, right beside my ear, intimate and impossibly close. I stumbled backward until I hit the wall, my flashlight beam wildly scanning the room. The seats in the observation area had been empty moments before, I was certain of it. Now indistinct shapes occupied several of them, darker patches of shadow that seemed to absorb my flashlight's beam rather than be illuminated by it. They had no clear features, no definable outlines, yet I sensed them watching me with acute, hungry interest. The door. I had to try again. I lunged for it, grasping the handle with both hands, pulling with all my strength. It gave way so suddenly that I fell backward, sprawling onto the corridor floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not bothering to close the door behind me. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, stretching impossibly before me. The doors I passed were all closed now, though I distinctly recalled leaving some open during my exploration. Behind one, something heavy slammed repeatedly against the metal, denting it outward in rhythmic blows that matched the breathing sound that now filled the entire floor. I reached the stairwell and practically threw myself down the steps, taking them 3 at a time, my camera bag slamming painfully against my back. The concrete walls seemed to be closing in, the space between flights narrowing. At the 3rd floor landing, I caught a glimpse of movement through the door's small window, a figure walking unhurriedly past, its movements jerky and unnatural. When I reached the 2nd floor, the breathing sound changed, becoming multiple overlapping rhythms, dozens of unseen lungs drawing air in desperate, ragged gasps. The hospital was awakening around me, filling with unseen presences that pressed against the thin membrane separating their reality from mine. I continued downward, finally reaching the 1st floor. The West Wing corridor stretched before me, seeming darker than before despite my flashlight. I ran its length, feet splashing through puddles that hadn't been there earlier. The liquid soaked through my shoes, warm and viscous. The double doors separating the wings were closed again, the chain I had cut somehow reattached and whole. I slammed against them in panic, and they burst open as if they'd never been secured at all. The central hallway was transformed. Though structurally unchanged, it now seemed stretched and distorted, as if viewed through a warped lens. The walls pulsed subtly, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the breathing that had become so loud it was almost tangible. My flashlight beam weakened further, barely penetrating the thick darkness that had no natural explanation. I ran blindly now, following the path I'd taken hours earlier, certain that each turn would somehow be wrong, that the hospital was rearranging itself around me. Patient rooms that had been empty now emitted sounds as I passed, shuffling movements, whispered conversations, the squeak of metal bed frames under shifting weight. From one room came a child's laughter, high and delighted, cutting off abruptly as I passed. From another, the unmistakable sound of surgical tools clinking against a metal tray. The entrance hall appeared ahead, moonlight filtering through the front door's windows, offering the first natural light I'd seen in what felt like hours. I sprinted toward it, hope surging. 20 feet from the exit, my flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness broken only by that distant moonlight. I kept moving, hands outstretched before me. 15 feet. 10. Something caught my ankle, a hand, cold and strong, emerging from a grate in the floor. I kicked wildly until it released me, then staggered forward. 5 feet from the door, I heard it, a voice, directly behind me, speaking in a hoarse whisper. "We've been waiting for you to come back." I threw myself at the exit, slamming into the heavy wooden doors with my full weight. They didn't move. Locked. Impossible. I come through them just hours ago. My hands frantically searched for the lock mechanism as the breathing sounds swelled around me, accompanied now by shuffling footsteps approaching from every corridor. My fingers found the deadbolt and twisted. The door opened, and I burst through into the cool night air. I ran across the overgrown grounds, not daring to look back until I'd reached my car. As I fumbled with my keys, I finally turned. St. Augustine stood silent and dark against the night sky. No lights, no movement, no sound carried across the empty grounds. Just an abandoned building, awaiting its scheduled demolition. I drove away with shaking hands, checking my rearview mirror repeatedly until the hospital disappeared from view. When I reached my apartment an hour later, I immediately connected my camera to my computer, needing to prove to myself that I had actually been there, that I had documentation of the building before. Whatever had happened, the memory card was empty, not corrupted, not damaged, completely empty, as if I'd never taken a single photograph. That was 3 weeks ago. I've tried to convince myself that what I experienced was some sort of hallucination, perhaps triggered by mold spores or chemical residue in the hospital's air. A rational explanation for an irrational experience. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that something followed me home. The apartment feels different now, colder in certain rooms. My sleep is constantly interrupted by sounds I cannot identify, scratching in the walls, whispered conversations that stop when I fully wake, and sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, the sound of labored breathing just outside my bedroom door. Most disturbing of all are the dreams. Every night, I find myself back in that operating theater, strapped to the stainless steel table. Shadowy figures observe from the seats above as dark liquid drips onto my face from the ceiling. They lean forward eagerly, whispering among themselves. The procedure is ready to begin, one always announces. It's been 30 years since our last patient. Let's make sure this one survives. I wake each time as cold hands press a mask over my face, the sweet smell of ether filling my lungs. Each morning, I discover new bruises on my wrists and ankles, perfectly matching the restraint points on the surgical table. Yesterday, I received a letter from the Historical Society. The demolition of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital has been postponed indefinitely due to unexpected complications with the property deed. The building will remain standing. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see it waiting for me, its corridors stretching endlessly, its rooms filled with watching shadows, its walls pulsing gently with each labored breath. And I know with absolute certainty that I will return. Not because I want to, but because it won't give me any choice. The hospital has claimed me as its patient. The procedure must be completed. I can hear breathing in my apartment now, drawing closer as I write these words. The air grows colder around me. The lights flicker. It's found me again. The procedure is ready to begin. The first thing I noticed about St. Margaret's Psychiatric Hospital was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that falls over a forest at dusk, but a dense, suffocating absence that seemed to devour sound. Even the distant hum of traffic from the highway 2 miles away felt muted, as if some invisible barrier surrounded the property, keeping the world at bay. I'd come to photograph the building for a local history project. Nothing unusual about that. As an architectural photographer, I documented dozens of abandoned structures across the state. This was just another job, another paycheck, another day of wading through dust and memories. At least, that's what I told myself as I parked my car at the edge of the crumbling parking lot. The asphalt fractured by decades of neglect and persistent weeds. The facility had closed in 1987 after a series of scandals and budget cuts, leaving the sprawling complex to slowly decompose at the edge of our small town. Most locals avoided it entirely, claiming it was dangerous, structurally unsound. A few teenagers occasionally broke in on dares, but otherwise, St. Margaret's had been left to crumble in peace. The caretaker who'd unlocked the gate for me had been eager to leave. "I'll be back at 4 to lock up," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Don't go into the east wing. Floor's not safe." Then he'd hurried back to his truck, leaving me alone with my camera bag and the massive building looming ahead. Standing in the shadow of the main entrance, I felt unexpectedly small. The hospital was larger than I'd anticipated. A sprawling Victorian monstrosity with later additions spanning different architectural eras. A physical timeline of changing approaches to mental health care. The central building rose 4 stories, its red brick facade darkened with decades of pollution and mildew. Ornate stonework framed tall, narrow windows, most of them intact but clouded with grime. I checked my watch. 10:17 a.m., nearly 6 hours to capture what I needed. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges protesting with a long, mournful creak that echoed through the entrance hall. The smell hit me immediately, that distinctive aroma of abandoned places. Mold and dust and decay, underlaid with something medicinal that had somehow persisted through the decades. Disinfectant, perhaps, or old medicines. The air felt thick, almost resistant as I breathed it in. The entrance hall was grand but desolate. A wide staircase curved upward to my right, while hallways branched outward like arteries from a failing heart. Light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams that illuminated the debris scattered across the tiled floor. Fallen ceiling tiles, bird droppings, crumpled papers. I set down my equipment and unzipped my camera bag, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. This was purely routine. I'd photographed the main architectural features first, then move through the different wards, capturing the evolution of the facility over time. Simple, methodical work. I'd done it countless times before. The first hour passed uneventfully. I photographed the grand staircase, the administrative offices, the old reception area with its massive wooden desks still anchored to the floor. Patient records and documents had long since been removed, but the bones of the building told their own story. High ceilings in the oldest sections, barred windows in some areas, heavy doors with small observation windows and external locks. The building grew darker as I moved deeper into the ground floor. The electricity had been cut decades ago, and the windows became smaller and more sparse. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom and catching on strange shapes. An overturned wheelchair, a rusty medical cart, a fallen light fixture dangling from frayed wires. The first odd thing I noticed was the temperature change. As I entered what had once been a communal area, the air grew noticeably colder. Not just cooler, as one might expect in a shadowed area, but actually cold, as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath formed small clouds before my face, and I zipped my jacket higher, rubbing my suddenly bare arms. Just a draft, I muttered, my voice sounding flat and strange in the empty space. Old buildings had uneven temperatures, it was perfectly natural. Heat rising in some areas, cold air pooling in others. Nothing unusual. Yet as I continued through the room, the cold spot followed me. Or perhaps I was following it, drawn forward by some subconscious curiosity. The room opened into a long corridor lined with what must have been patient rooms. Small, cell-like spaces with heavy doors. I paused at the first door, which hung partially open. The nameplate still clung to its surface. Room 117. Inside was a small space with a metal bed frame bolted to the floor, a single barred window letting in a thin shaft of light. The walls were institutional green, the paint bubbling and peeling in long strips that curled toward the floor like flayed skin. Something about the room set my teeth on edge. It looked ordinary enough, identical to countless other institutional rooms I'd photographed. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the corner. From that patch of shadow my flashlight couldn't quite dispel. I raised my camera anyway, framing the shot. The viewfinder showed only an empty room, the play of light and shadow across the decaying surfaces. I pressed the shutter, and the flash briefly illuminated every corner. Nothing there. Of course there wasn't. I continued down the hallway, photographing interesting architectural details. The original tilework that peeked through broken sections of linoleum. The ornate ceiling moldings that had somehow survived decades of neglect. Yet the deeper I went, the more unsettled I felt. The cold spot had dissipated, but now the silence seemed to press against my eardrums, as if the air itself had grown denser. I found myself moving more quickly, taking fewer photos, glancing over my shoulder more often. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, shuffling steps that stopped when I did. But each time I turned, the hallway was empty, stretching back to where I'd come from, filled with nothing but dust and shadow. At one point, I found myself in what must have been a treatment room. Drains lined the tiled floor, and heavy metal fixtures protruded from the walls. Rusty stains marked the tiles in uneven patterns. I didn't want to consider what had caused them. On the wall, someone had scrawled something in what looked like red paint. The words were faded, but still legible. They never left. Graffiti, I told myself. Teenagers breaking in, leaving their mark. Nothing more. But why did the handwriting look so old? And why did the red substance flake away under my fingertip like dried blood? I brushed my hand against my jeans, suddenly eager to move on. By noon, I had covered most of the ground floor and was ready to ascend to the upper levels. I returned to the main staircase, its once grand sweep now covered in debris and bird droppings. As I placed my foot on the first step, a sound froze me in place. A long, rattling sigh that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was just the building settling, I told myself. Old structures made all sorts of noises, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, materials gradually giving way to gravity and time. Perfectly natural. But why did it sound so much like someone exhaling after holding their breath for too long? The second floor was dedicated to what appeared to be more specialized treatment rooms. Equipment still remained in some areas, a rusty hydrotherapy tub, a chair with leather restraints, metal cabinets with shattered glass doors. In one room, I found a collection of electroshock devices laid out on a table, as if prepared for use. I photographed them methodically, focusing on the technical aspects, composition, lighting, detail, rather than dwelling on what these devices had once been used for. On the people who had once been strapped down, electrodes attached to their temples, their bodies convulsing as current passed through their brains. Was that a whimper I heard from the corner? I spun around, my heart suddenly pounding. Nothing, just shadows and dust. I moved on quickly. The third floor housed what seemed to be administrative offices and staff rooms. More paperwork scattered across floors. Filing cabinets tipped over, chairs overturned. Decades of decay had transformed an ordinary workspace into something from a nightmare. The mundane objects twisted into grotesque shapes by time and neglect. I had nearly finished photographing this level when I noticed something odd about one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. According to the building's layout, there shouldn't have been a room there at all. The corridor should have ended at a wall. Yet there was clearly a doorway, hanging partially open, revealing darkness beyond. My rational mind suggested I'd simply misunderstood the building's floor plan. Old hospitals were often expanded and modified over the years, with wings added and removed as needs changed. It was perfectly reasonable that an additional room had been constructed at some point. Yet something about that doorway made my skin crawl. The darkness beyond seemed thicker somehow, as if it had substance and weight. I approached slowly, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck. The door was different from the others, older, made of heavier wood, with an ornate handle that looked more suited to a Victorian manor than a psychiatric hospital. The nameplate was tarnished brass rather than the plastic labels on other doors. It read simply, "Observation." My hand trembled slightly as I pushed the door wider. The hinges moved silently, as if recently oiled. The room beyond was unlike any other in the hospital. Where the rest of the building had been stripped and vandalized, this space appeared perfectly preserved, even meticulously maintained. A large desk dominated the center, its surface clear except for a single leather-bound book. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient-looking tomes with faded spines. A grandfather clock stood in one corner, its pendulum still, its hands frozen at 3:33. The air here was different too. Not cold like the spot I'd encountered earlier, but thick and heavy, with a cloying sweetness that reminded me of overripe fruit or decaying flowers. The light seemed to behave strangely, not quite reaching the corners of the room, as if the darkness there actively resisted illumination. Every instinct told me to leave, to close the door and continue with my work elsewhere. Yet I found myself stepping inside, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain. The book on the desk called to me. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by a thick oriental rug that covered most of the floor. A rug that appeared spotless despite the decades of dust that coated everything else in the hospital. The book lay precisely in the center of the desk, its dark leather binding cracked with age. No title marked its cover or spine. I reached out to touch it, half expecting my hand to pass through it like a mirage. But the leather was solid beneath my fingertips, warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been in the cool air of the abandoned building. I opened it carefully, the spine crackling in protest. The pages were filled with handwritten notes. The ink faded to a rusty brown. The handwriting was elegant but difficult to read, the letters flowing together in a style that seemed to belong to another century. I squinted, trying to make out the words. Patient exhibits remarkable sensitivity to the treatment. Responded to stimuli that should have been imperceptible. Shows promising connection to the other side. I flipped through more pages, finding similar notes interspersed with diagrams. Strange circular patterns and anatomical drawings that didn't quite match human anatomy. The dates at the top of the pages went back further than the hospital's official founding. Some entries dated as early as 1843. One particular entry caught my eye, dated November 17th, 1953. The barrier grows thinner. SM has made contact again. Speaks of entities eager to return. Must strengthen the binding before All Souls' Night. Subjects in East Wing showing signs of influence. Self-harm, speaking in tongues, drawing the patterns without having seen them. The director insists we continue. May God forgive us. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I became acutely aware of how silent the room had become. Not just quiet, but utterly devoid of sound, as if the air itself had thickened to the point where sound waves could no longer travel through it. Even the ambient noises of the building, the creaking of timbers, the distant drip of water, had disappeared. I closed the book quickly and turned to leave, suddenly desperate to be anywhere else. But as I reached the doorway, I realized with a sinking feeling that the corridor outside had changed. The hallway that had led me here was gone, replaced by a longer, darker passage that stretched in both directions, lined with doors identical to the one I just passed through. Panic rose in my throat. I was disoriented, yes, but I couldn't possibly have gotten lost. I'd been methodically documenting the building, maintaining a clear mental map of its layout. This hallway simply hadn't been here before. I reached for my phone to check the time, to ground myself in something normal and rational. The screen remained black when I pressed the button. Dead, despite having been fully charged when I arrived. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding strange and muffled in the thick air. "You're tired. You've gotten turned around. That's all." I chose a direction, right, and began walking, determined to find my way back to the main staircase. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors on either side identical and unmarked. My flashlight beam appeared dimmer now, barely penetrating the gloom more than a few feet ahead. The silence was broken by a sound that made me freeze mid-step, a long, low moan that seemed to emanate from behind one of the doors, a sound of such profound anguish that it made my chest tighten in sympathetic pain. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it as my voice seemed to hang in the air, flat and lifeless. "Is someone there?" No response came, but as I listened, I became aware of other sounds, subtle at first, then increasingly distinct. Whispers from behind the doors, the soft shuffling of feet on tile, the rattling of handles as if someone or something was trying to get out. I began to run, my camera bouncing against my chest, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The corridor seemed to elongate with each step, stretching impossibly before me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. And then, abruptly, I was back at the main staircase, gasping for breath, my legs trembling beneath me. The ordinary sounds of the abandoned building had returned. Creaking timber, distant drips, the soft rustle of leaves against windows. I gripped the banister, trying to steady myself. Had I imagined it all? Was I suffering from some kind of episode? A panic attack, perhaps triggered by the oppressive atmosphere of the place? I checked my phone again. It powered on normally, the screen illuminating to show the time. 2:47 p.m. I'd lost nearly an hour. I needed to leave. Whatever historic value this building held, whatever photographs I still needed to take, none of it was worth the crawling dread that had settled under my skin. I would make my excuses to the Historical Society. Tell them the structure was unsafe, too damaged for proper documentation. But as I turned to descend the stairs, a figure stood at the bottom, looking up at me. My heart seemed to stop, then restart at double speed. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned doctor's coat, so white it seemed to glow in the dim light. But where its face should have been was only shadow, a void deeper than mere absence of light. I remained frozen, unable to move, unable even to scream. The figure tilted its head, a curiously human gesture from something so inhuman, and raised one hand slowly, beckoning me down. "You should not be here," it said, its voice a dry whisper that somehow carried perfectly to my ears. "Not yet. Your appointment is not until November." I backed away, my heel catching on the step behind me. I stumbled, catching myself on the railing. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the whisper remained, now seeming to come from directly beside my ear. "We have been waiting for you." I ran, back up the stairs, down the corridor, taking random turns, no longer caring about finding my way out so much as getting away from that voice, from the cold spot that once again followed me, from the feeling of eyes watching from every shadowed corner. I found myself in a part of the hospital I hadn't yet explored. The East Wing, I realized, the section the caretaker had warned me about. The floor here was indeed damaged. Sections of it collapsed to reveal the level below. The walls were blackened in places, suggesting a fire had swept through this area at some point. But most disturbing were the patient rooms. Unlike the empty chambers I'd seen elsewhere, these rooms still contained beds. And in those beds, dark shapes lay beneath stained sheets. Shapes that, from a distance, resembled human forms. I knew they couldn't be real bodies. The hospital had been closed for decades. Any remains would have been discovered long ago. These had to be bundles of clothing, or mannequins placed by vandals, or simply tricks of light and shadow. Yet as I passed one room, I distinctly saw a sheet move, rise and fall, as if with breath. I quickened my pace, no longer even pretending to document the building. I just wanted out. But the corridors twisted impossibly, leading me deeper into the East Wing rather than toward an exit. Doors that should have led to stairwells opened onto more patient rooms. Windows that should have shown the outside world revealed only brick walls or, more terrifyingly, identical hospital corridors that couldn't possibly exist in the building's actual layout. The whispers had grown louder, more numerous, a constant susurration that seemed to press against my eardrums. Words occasionally became clear, finally returned. The treatment never really left. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into near darkness broken only by the dim light filtering through distant windows. The temperature plummeted again, my breath forming clouds before my face. My hands grew numb with cold, and I shoved them into my pockets, my right hand closing around something I hadn't put there. Something thin and metallic. Pulled it out. A key, old and brass, with an ornate head and a tag attached by a piece of twine. The tag read "Exit" in faded ink. I had no idea where it had come from or what it was supposed to open, but in my increasingly panicked state, it seemed like a lifeline. I began trying it in every door I passed, desperation mounting as each lock refused to turn. As I moved through the corridors, I became aware of movement at the edges of my vision. Dark shapes flitting behind me, always disappearing when I turned to look. The feeling of being watched intensified until it was almost a physical pressure against my skin. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a grandfather clock chiming. The same clock I'd seen in the observation room, its hands frozen at 3:33. I counted the chimes, 1, 2, 3. It stopped at 3. 3:33. The witching hour plus 3 minutes. The time when the barrier was thinnest, according to folklore. As the last chime faded, every door in the corridor swung open simultaneously, the sound like a collective exhalation. From within the rooms came light, not the warm glow of electricity or sunlight, but a cold, blue-white illumination that pulsed like a heartbeat. Silhouettes appeared in the doorways, human-shaped but wrong somehow, their proportions subtly distorted, their movements jerky and unnatural. They began to emerge from the rooms, moving toward me with a terrible purpose. I ran, no longer caring which direction I went, simply trying to put distance between myself and those advancing figures. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me forward through the twisting corridors of the East Wing. I turned a corner and found myself facing a door unlike the others. Larger, made of metal rather than wood, with a complex lock mechanism. The word "exit" was painted across it in faded red letters. With shaking hands, I tried the key. It slid into the lock smoothly, as if it had been crafted specifically for this purpose. I turned it, hearing the heavy internal mechanism shift and click. Behind me, the whispers had grown to a roar, and the temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on the walls. The advancing figures were closer now, their features becoming clearer. Faces twisted in expressions of agony, bodies bearing the marks of forgotten treatments and restraints. I pulled the door open and practically fell through it, slamming it shut behind me. The key wouldn't come out of the lock, so I left it there, hearing the mechanism re-engage as I released it. I found myself in a narrow stairwell, spiraling downward. I descended as quickly as I dared, the steps slick with moisture, the walls pressing in close on either side. The whispers had faded, but my relief was short-lived, because as I descended, I began to hear something else. A rhythmic sound that I eventually recognized as footsteps, keeping pace with my own but slightly out of sync, as if someone was following me down the stairs, matching my speed but always one step behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see what might be there, what might be gaining on me with each turn of the spiral. I simply kept moving, one hand trailing along the damp wall for balance, the other held before me in the darkness. The stairwell seemed to go down much further than should have been possible given the hospital's height. I'd long since passed what should have been ground level, descending into what felt like the bowels of the earth itself. The air grew warmer rather than cooler, thick with moisture and the smell of decay. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a narrow tunnel with rough stone walls. Not part of the hospital's original architecture, but something older, something that predated the institution built above it. A faint light glowed at the distant end of the tunnel. With no other option, I moved toward it, acutely aware of the footsteps that had stopped when I did. now resuming their steady rhythm behind me. The tunnel opened into a large circular chamber with a domed ceiling. The source of the light became clear. Candles, hundreds of them, arranged in concentric circles around a central platform. The platform itself was stained dark, the stone worn smooth as if by centuries of use. On the walls, painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood, were the same circular patterns I'd seen in the leather-bound book. Complex, interlocking designs that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And standing around the platform, still as statues, were figures in white coats. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, their faces hidden in shadow despite the candlelight that illuminated everything else. At the head of the platform stood the figure I'd seen at the staircase, its featureless face now turned toward me. In its hands it held something that gleamed in the candlelight, a surgical saw, its toothed edge crusted with what could only be decades of dried blood. "Your appointment was not scheduled until November," it said again, its voice now accompanied by a chorus of whispers from the other figures. "But since you've arrived early, we can begin the treatment now." They began to move toward me, slow but purposeful, closing the circle, cutting off any path of escape. In that moment, as terror threatened to overwhelm me completely, my hand brushed against something in my pocket, my car keys, and attached to them, a small penlight that I'd forgotten I carried. I switched it on, its beam pathetically small in the vast chamber. But its light was different from the candlelight, clean and electric, a product of the rational world above. I directed it at the approaching figures, and where the beam touched them, they seemed to waver, like heat mirages on summer asphalt. The lead figure, the doctor with no face, raised its hand as if to shield itself from the light. The motion gave me an idea. My camera, the flash. I raised it with trembling hands, pointed it at the approaching circle of figures, and pressed the shutter. The flash exploded in the chamber, blindingly bright for a fraction of a second. The effect was immediate. The figures contorted, their forms seeming to tear like paper in a flame. The whispers rose to screams, a cacophony of agony that made me cover my ears. The candles flickered wildly, and the patterns on the walls seemed to writhe as if alive. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, charging through the gap that had opened in the circle, back into the tunnel. Behind me, the screams continued, accompanied now by a rumbling sound like distant thunder. I ran until my lungs burned, following the tunnel as it curved upward, eventually emerging into what appeared to be a boiler room. A normal, mundane boiler room, part of the hospital's infrastructure. Dusty and abandoned, but blessedly real. From there, I found my way to a service stairwell and then, finally, to an exit. I burst through the door into the late afternoon sunlight, gasping for breath, my clothing soaked with sweat. The caretaker was just getting out of his truck, looking surprised to see me emerging from a side entrance. "You're early," he said, checking his watch. "It's only 3:45. I couldn't speak. I simply handed him my visitor's badge with shaking hands and headed for my car. I drove away from St. Margaret's without looking back, my camera forgotten on the passenger seat. That was 3 weeks ago. I delivered the photographs I'd taken, the ones from before I entered the observation room, to the Historical Society. They were pleased, commented on my attention to detail, asked if I'd consider documenting other historic buildings in the area. I declined. The nightmares started the night after my visit. Always the same. I'm back in the circular chamber, strapped to the central platform. The faceless doctor leans over me, saw in hand, whispering about treatments and barriers and the other side. I wake screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced I can still hear whispers in the darkness of my bedroom. But the dreams aren't the worst part. It's the other things, the cold spots that follow me from room to room in my apartment. The whispers I hear when I'm alone. The glimpses of white-coated figures at the edges of my vision. And the key. The brass key with the tag reading exit that I found in my pocket 3 days ago, despite having left it in the lock of that metal door in the East Wing. Most troubling of all is what I discovered when reviewing the few photographs I managed to take in the East Wing before my flashlight died. In several images, barely visible in the background, are what appear to be patients. Gaunt, hollow-eyed figures in hospital gowns, standing in doorways or at the ends of corridors. Figures that I'm certain weren't there when I took the photographs. In the final image, the last one I took before finding that metal door, I can make out a figure standing directly behind me, so close it must have been looking over my shoulder as I photographed an empty patient room. A tall, thin figure in a doctor's coat, its face a blur of shadow, and around its neck hangs a brass key on a length of twine. The historical society called yesterday. They want me to return to St. Margaret's. Apparently, I missed an entire section of the building, the underground levels, the original treatment rooms from the 1800s. They were particularly interested in a circular chamber mentioned in the hospital's early records, used for specialized treatments of particularly sensitive patients. They said they'd scheduled my visit for the first week of November. I haven't given them an answer yet. Part of me knows I should refuse, should run as far from St. Margaret's as possible. But another part, a part that grows stronger with each passing day, with each cold spot and whispered voice, feels drawn back to that place. As if I left something important behind, as if my treatment isn't complete. The brass key sits on my desk as I write this, catching the light from my lamp. Sometimes, when I'm not looking directly at it, I swear it moves, shifting position slightly, turning to point toward the hospital on the hill. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I hear the distant chiming of a grandfather clock, 3 solemn tones that echo through my apartment. 3:33. The time when the barrier is thinnest. The time when they can reach through. I think I will go back to St. Margaret's after all. I think I've had an appointment there all along. The assignment should have been simple. As a freelance photographer specializing in urban decay, I documented countless abandoned buildings, factories whose machines had long fallen silent, schools where no children's laughter had echoed for decades, homes where families once gathered around dinner tables now rotted and collapsed. Hollowed-out spaces always spoke to me, revealing stories in their peeling paint and crumbling facades that most people never stopped to hear. But Ravensbrück Psychiatric Hospital was different. I felt it from the moment I parked my car at the edge of the overgrown service road, half a mile from the main building. The late September air held the first bite of autumn, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil as I gathered my equipment from the trunk. My editor had been persistent about this location for our Forgotten Places feature, a sprawling psychiatric facility that had been abandoned since the late 1980s after a series of patient deaths and subsequent budget cuts had forced its closure. Perfect for our Halloween issue, he'd said. I checked my phone, still 3 bars of service, and sent a quick text to my sister. At the location. Should be back by sundown. Her reply came almost instantly. Be careful. Those places are always full of asbestos and tetanus waiting to happen. I smiled, tucked the phone into my jacket pocket, and shouldered my camera bag. The approach to Ravensbrück was longer than I expected. The narrow maintenance road wound through dense woods that seemed to grow more oppressive with each step. Tall pines blocked most of the afternoon sunlight, creating a premature twilight even though it was only 2:30 p.m. The air felt heavier here, almost resistant against my skin as I walked. I'd researched Ravensbrück before coming. Opened in 1923 as a state-of-the-art facility for the mentally ill, it had once been considered revolutionary in its treatment approaches. By the 1960s, it housed over 3,000 patients. But like many such institutions, rumors of mistreatment began to surface, whispers of experimental therapies gone wrong, of patients who died under mysterious circumstances. Budget cuts in the 70s led to overcrowding and understaffing, and conditions deteriorated rapidly. After several patient suicides in 1987, all within a 6-month period, and a subsequent investigation that uncovered egregious violations, the facility was closed permanently. The buildings had stood empty ever since, too costly for demolition, too stigmatized for repurposing. When I finally cleared the tree line, I stopped short, taking in my first full view of Ravensbrück. The main building rose 5 stories high, a massive red brick structure with classical columns framing the entrance, its once grand facade now crumbling and stained with decades of exposure. Rows of windows, many broken or boarded up, lined each floor like empty eye sockets. 2 wings extended from either side of the central building, stretching outward like open arms waiting to embrace new arrivals. Behind the main structure, I could make out the roofs of smaller outbuildings, partially obscured by overgrowth. Nothing I hadn't seen before in other abandoned institutions. And yet, there was a weight to the silence surrounding Ravensbrook that I couldn't quite explain. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just a dense, expectant quiet, as if the entire property were holding its breath, waiting for something. I pulled out my camera and took several exterior shots, documenting the grand entrance with its faded lettering above the door, the ivy climbing up the eastern wing, the small administrative building to the right with its collapsed roof. Normal procedure, starting with establishing shots before moving inside. My footsteps crunched loudly on the gravel as I approached the main entrance, the sound seeming to echo despite the open air. The massive wooden doors were chained shut, but I'd already spotted my point of entry during my research, a service entrance on the west side that urban explorers had documented as accessible. Skirting around the building, I found the metal door hanging partially open, its hinges rusted and bent. I pulled out my flashlight, tested it with a quick flick, and slipped inside. The service corridor was narrow, its walls a dingy institutional green that had faded to a sickly, mottled hue. The air inside was noticeably colder than outside, with a damp quality that immediately settled into my clothing. More than the cold, though, I noticed the smell. A complex miasma of mildew, decaying wood, old paper, and something else. Something chemical and vaguely medicinal, like old antiseptic that had fermented over decades. I'd been in enough abandoned hospitals to recognize the usual sense of decay, but this had an undercurrent I couldn't place, something almost organic, like meat left too long in a refrigerator during a power outage. I breathed through my mouth and pressed forward. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint and water stains spreading across the ceiling like disease. I took several shots, adjusting my settings to capture the play of light and shadow. The corridor opened into what appeared to be a reception area, with a massive wooden desk dominating the center of the room. Behind it, cubbyholes that once held patient files now gaped empty, save for a few scattered papers that had somehow escaped removal or looting. I approached the desk, running my finger through decades of dust. Old clipboards and faded forms still littered the surface, as if the staff had simply walked out mid-shift. Among them, something caught my eye, a leather-bound logbook, its cover cracked with age. I carefully opened it, finding patient admission records from 1987, the facility's final year of operation. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, a sharp noise from somewhere deep within the building froze me mid-motion. A metallic clang like a door closing or something heavy falling. Then silence again. Old buildings settle. I knew this. They groan and shift, especially on days when the temperature changes rapidly. And yet, I waited, listening. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing, which suddenly seemed too loud in the stillness. Shaking off my unease, I continued exploring, moving from the reception area down another corridor that opened into a large day room. Dust-covered furniture was arranged in conversation circles. Some chairs overturned, tables pushed against walls. Sunlight filtered weakly through grimy windows, creating pale columns in the dusty air. In one corner, an ancient television set sat on a wheeled cart, its screen shattered, like a blind eye staring into nothingness. I spent nearly an hour photographing the first floor, documenting the cafeteria with its long tables still arranged in neat rows, the industrial kitchen with massive equipment covered in rust, the administrative offices with their toppled filing cabinets and scattered paperwork. Throughout, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me turn quickly more than once, only to find empty rooms and vacant doorways. When I reached the main stairwell leading to the upper floors, I hesitated. The stairs were concrete and seemed stable enough, but something about the darkness that pooled at the top made me pause. I played my flashlight up the steps, noting the graffiti that marked the walls, crude drawings and the usual keep-out warnings left by teenagers who'd ventured inside over the years. But one piece of graffiti, scrawled in what looked like black marker near the top of the stairs, was different. The doctors are still seeing patients. A chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperature ran through me. Just vandals trying to scare people, I told myself. I'd seen similar things in other abandoned places. Attempts to create urban legends, to make ordinary decay seem more sinister. I took a photo of the graffiti and started up the steps. The second floor housed patient rooms, dozens of them lining long corridors that stretched into darkness. Most doors stood open, revealing small spaces with metal bed frames still bolted to the floors, some with bare, stained mattresses still in place. Iron radiators lurked under windows secured with rusted metal mesh. The rooms were nearly identical, differentiated only by room numbers painted on the doors and the unique patterns of decay that had claimed each space. I moved slowly down the hall, photographing rooms that showed interesting compositions of light and shadow, unusual damage or items left behind. A hairbrush on a windowsill, a single shoe under a bed, a faded drawing tacked to a wall. In one room, a collection of small plastic bottles lined a shelf, medication containers, their labels long since faded to illegibility. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by my footsteps and the occasional drip of water from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. But as I moved deeper into the corridor, I became aware of another sound. So faint I wasn't sure if I was actually hearing it or if my mind was manufacturing noise to fill the vacuum. A soft, rhythmic whisper, like breathing. I stopped, holding my own breath to listen. There it was, a gentle in-out, barely audible even in the complete stillness. I told myself it was just air moving through the building, finding paths through broken windows and cracked walls. Old buildings breathe. Another fact I knew well. I continued down the corridor, but now the sound seemed to follow me, sometimes fading, sometimes growing slightly louder, but never disappearing entirely. I focused on my work, documenting the slow reclamation of the human space by time and elements, but my attention kept splitting, part of me always listening for that soft respiratory rhythm. At the end of the hall, a set of heavy double doors stood closed. A sign above them, partially obscured by water damage, read Ward C, Severe Cases. Unlike most doors I'd encountered so far, these were locked, a heavy chain wrapped around the handles. But the chain hung loose, as if someone had unwrapped it just enough to slip through without removing it entirely. I shouldn't go in there. The thought came unbidden, carrying a certainty I couldn't explain. But I'd come to document the hospital, and whatever lay beyond those doors was part of its story. I moved the chain just enough to create a gap and squeezed through, metal links cold against my skin as I passed. Ward C was different. While the rest of the building felt abandoned, decayed but relatively untouched, this area showed signs of destruction that went beyond natural deterioration. Ceiling tiles had been torn down, exposing pipes and wiring. Doors hung from single hinges or had been removed entirely. Walls bore deep gouges as if someone or something had clawed at them repeatedly. The breathing sound was louder here, with a wet, ragged quality that made me think of congested lungs. I played my flashlight across the walls, noting dark stains that ran from ceiling to floor in rusty streaks. Water damage, I told myself. Rust from pipes leaking over decades. In one room, larger than the others, with restraint hooks still bolted to the walls and floor, I found a metal cabinet that had somehow escaped the worst of the destruction. Its drawers were locked, but one had been partially pulled out, bent at an awkward angle. Inside, I could see folders, patient records that hadn't been removed during the evacuation. My journalistic curiosity overrode my growing unease. I set my camera down and worked the damaged drawer open further, removing a handful of manila folders. Each contained a patient file, complete with black and white ID photos paper-clipped to admission forms. The photos showed vacant eyes and expressionless faces, men and women of various ages, all bearing the same institutional look of heavily medicated detachment. As I leafed through the files, my flashlight began to flicker. I tapped it against my palm, and the beam stabilized momentarily before starting to pulse again, growing dimmer with each flash. Soon I was in near darkness, with only the weak ambient light filtering through dirty windows to see by. I reached for my phone to use its flashlight, but as I pulled it from my pocket, a sound from the doorway made me freeze. A soft scraping, like slippered feet dragging across the floor. I turned slowly, my phone's screen casting a feeble blue glow that illuminated nothing beyond my hand. The breathing sound had stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. "Hello!" My voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself were absorbing the sound. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Then, as my eyes strained to penetrate the darkness, I caught a whiff of that odd smell again. Stronger now, the medicinal tinge overlaid with something putrid and organic, like gangrene, like rotting flesh. I activated my phone's flashlight and pointed it toward the doorway. Empty. The corridor beyond was vacant as well, stretching into darkness in both directions. But something had changed. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't name. And though I could see no one, the sensation of being watched had intensified until it felt like a physical touch crawling across my skin. I needed to leave. Now, gathering my camera, I moved toward the door, but as I reached the threshold, every instinct screamed at me to stop. Something was in the hallway. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I felt its presence. A density in the air, a pressure against my consciousness. My phone's flashlight beam wavered, then died completely, the screen going black. Battery must be dead. But that was impossible. It had been at 87% when I checked it at the entrance. I was in complete darkness now, save for the gray rectangles of the windows at either end of the long corridor. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shapes of doorways lining the hall, black holes in the gray walls, and something else. A darker patch in the darkness, about 20 feet away. A shape denser than the shadows around it, roughly human-sized but somehow wrong in its proportions. Too tall, too thin, its limbs at awkward angles. It wasn't moving, but I knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought and lodged directly in my hindbrain, that it was aware of me. I took a step backward, into the relative safety of the room I'd just been exploring. My heel caught on something, a loose floor tile perhaps, and I stumbled slightly. The soft sound of my shoe scuffing the floor seemed deafening in the silence. The shape in the hallway moved. Not toward me, not away, but sideways in a jerking motion that no human body could make, as if it had too many joints or none at all. Then it was still again. I couldn't go back the way I'd come, but there had to be another stairwell, another way down. Medical facilities always had multiple exits for safety. I eased along the wall, moving away from the shape in the hallway, deeper into Ward C. My hand trailed along the wall for guidance, feeling the uneven texture of peeling paint and crumbling plaster. But then, beneath my fingertips, the wall moved. It wasn't a dramatic movement, just a slight giving, as if the solid surface had momentarily softened beneath my touch. And was it my imagination, or did I feel something like a pulse, a rhythmic thrumming beneath the plaster? I yanked my hand away, heart hammering against my ribs. The darkness seemed to close in around me, thick as water, making each movement feel slow and resisted. The breathing sound had returned, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the walls, the floor, the ceiling. From inside my own head. I broke into a stumbling run, no longer caring about the noise I made, no longer trying to see where I was going. My only thought was to find stairs, an exit, any way out of Ward C. I careened off walls, bumped into door frames, tripped over debris on the floor. Behind me, or was it beside me? I heard movement, the soft drag of something heavy being pulled across the floor, the wet click of what might have been a mouth opening. At the end of the corridor, I spotted it, the illuminated exit sign, its red glow dim but unmistakable. Emergency stairs. I lunged toward it, throwing my shoulder against the push bar. The door resisted for one heart-stopping moment, then gave way with a shriek of rusted hinges. The stairwell was concrete, utilitarian, lit only by what little daylight filtered through small, wire-meshed windows at each landing. I took the stairs two at a time, nearly falling several times, the metallic taste of fear sharp on my tongue. Though I could hear nothing pursuing me, I couldn't shake the certainty that something was just behind me, reaching for me with hands that weren't quite hands. I burst through the door at the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a narrow corridor I didn't recognize. This wasn't the way I had come in. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors, no windows or obvious exits in sight. The air here was different, stagnant and thick, with that organic, putrid smell so strong it made my eyes water. For the first time, I wondered if I would actually make it out of Ravensbrück. I chose a direction at random and moved as quickly as I dared in the near darkness. My camera bag banged against my hip, its familiar weight now a comfort, a connection to the normal world outside these walls. I passed closed door after closed door, some with small observation windows, others solid metal. This area felt different from the upper floors, less decayed, somehow, as if it had been sealed off from the elements, preserved. The corridor ended in a T-junction. To the left, more darkness. To the right, a faint glow, daylight, perhaps, from a window or door. I turned right, hope flaring in my chest, only to stop short after a few steps. What I had taken for daylight was artificial, a fluorescent fixture flickering weakly overhead, impossibly functional after decades of abandonment. Beneath it stood a metal gurney, its surface stained dark, leather restraint straps hanging from its sides. That wasn't possible. There was no power in this building. No electricity to light even a single bulb. As I stood frozen, staring at the impossibility of that light, the bulb flickered more rapidly, then stabilized, growing brighter. In its strengthening glow, I could see that the gurney was not empty as I'd first thought. Something lay on it, covered by a stained sheet. A human-shaped form, small and still. The sheet moved, just a slight ripple, as if whatever lay beneath had drawn a shallow breath. I backed away, my camera forgotten, my only thought now to find an exit. Any exit. I turned to retrace my steps, but the corridor behind me had changed. Where there had been a long hallway lined with doors, there was now a solid wall no more than 10 feet away, covered in decades-old graffiti. The doctors are still seeing patients. My rational mind dissolved. I ran, no longer trying to navigate, just needing to move. I careened through doorways, down corridors that seemed to shift and change direction as I traversed them. Rooms that should have connected didn't. Hallways ended in walls that couldn't possibly be there. And everywhere, that breathing sound grew louder, more labored, as if the building itself were drawing ragged breaths through diseased lungs. I no longer knew what floor I was on, what section of the hospital I had wandered into. I wasn't even certain how long I had been inside. Minutes or hours, time had lost all meaning in the shifting corridors of Ravensbrück. After what felt like an eternity of frantic searching, I found myself in a large room with tiled walls and floors, some kind of treatment room or operating theater. Ancient equipment loomed in the shadows, a dental chair with rusty restraints, rolling tables bearing instruments I couldn't identify, glass-fronted cabinets filled with bottles. And covering every vertical surface, walls, cabinets, the backs of doors, were photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, yellowed with age but clearly visible in the dim light filtering through a single high window. Clinical photos of patients showing injuries, surgical procedures, physical abnormalities. Some depicted what appeared to be experimental treatments. Patients strapped to tables, hooked to machinery, their expressions ranging from vacant to terrified. But most disturbing were the progression photos, series showing the same patient over time, chronicling what appeared to be a deterioration rather than healing. In one series, a young woman's skin seemed to change texture from one photo to the next, becoming rough, almost scaly in appearance. In another, a man's limbs appeared to elongate unnaturally over successive images, joints bulging, bones visibly deforming beneath stretched skin. My gorge rose as I forced myself to look away from the walls. This wasn't standard psychiatric treatment, couldn't possibly be legitimate medical procedure. Whatever had happened in this room went beyond mere malpractice. A soft sound, fabric rustling against tile, made me whirl around. The room was empty, but the door I had entered through was now closed. Had I closed it? Couldn't remember. I crossed to the door and pulled on the handle. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, using both hands, throwing my weight backward. Nothing. It was as if the door had been sealed into its frame, becoming one with the wall around it. The high window was my only option now. It was small, maybe 18 inches square, but I was thin. I might be able to squeeze through. I dragged the dental chair across the floor, positioning it under the window. The chair's metal feet screeched against the tile, the sound echoing painfully in the enclosed space. I climbed onto the seat, then carefully stood, balancing as the old chair creaked beneath me. The window was just within reach. I pushed against it, finding it unlocked but swollen in its frame. With effort, it moved, opening outward an inch, then two. Fresh air seeped in, and I nearly sobbed with relief at the smell of normal, outside air. As I worked the window further open, something warm and wet splashed onto my upturned face from above. I flinched, thinking it was rain somehow coming through the small opening. But the liquid was too viscous for water, too warm. In the dim light, I could see it was dark-colored, almost black. More drops fell, pattering onto my face, my hands, the chair beneath me. I looked up at the ceiling and felt my sanity begin to slip. The ceiling was moving, pulsing. Sections of it bulged downward rhythmically, like a membrane inflating and deflating with each breath. The white tiles were stained with dark patches that seemed to be spreading even as I watched, seeping outward from the center of each bulge. And from dozens of hairline cracks, that dark liquid was dripping steadily, raining down into the room. I shoved at the window with renewed desperation. It opened further, enough that I could probably fit my shoulders through. I would have to go head first, a dangerous exit from what looked like a second-story height, but I no longer cared about injury. I just needed out. As I prepared to haul myself up, a drop of the dark liquid landed directly in my left eye. The burning was instantaneous and excruciating. I cried out, losing my balance, one hand flying up to my face as I toppled backward off the chair. I landed hard, my head striking the tile with enough force to send sparks across my vision. For a moment, I lay dazed, warm liquid from the ceiling continuing to drip onto my prone form. The burning in my eye spread, radiating outward until the entire left side of my face felt aflame. Then the pain changed, morphing into a sensation I can only describe as movement, as if whatever had dripped into my eye was now mobile, working its way through the tissue, burrowing deeper. I scrambled to my feet, wiping frantically at my face, my hands coming away smeared with dark matter that seemed to glisten with an oily iridescence even in the dim light. The stuff was all over me now, soaking through my clothes, clinging to my skin. And still, that breathing sound filled the room, louder than ever, syncing with the pulsations of the ceiling. In out, each exhalation bringing more of that dark fluid raining down. I lunged for the window again, no longer bothering with the chair. I jumped, catching the sill with my fingers, pulling myself up with strength born of pure terror. I forced my head and shoulders through the opening, feeling my jacket tear on the frame, not caring. Outside was a sheer drop of about 15 feet to overgrown grass. I'd likely break something, but that no longer mattered. As I wriggled further out, something caught my ankle. At first, I thought my foot had become tangled in my camera strap, but the pressure increased, becoming a grip, fingers wrapping around my leg, pulling me back inside. I kicked violently, connecting with something solid yet yielding, like flesh gone soft. There was a wet, tearing sound, and suddenly my leg was free. I pushed through the window, tumbling out into blessed open air before hitting the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. For several seconds, I lay gasping on the ground, feeling the cool grass against my face, smelling earth and vegetation instead of decay and chemicals. The pain in my eye had subsided to a dull throb, and I could see clearly from both eyes when I finally pushed myself up to sitting. No dark matter clung to my skin or clothes. My jacket was torn at the shoulder, but otherwise I was intact. My camera bag had somehow stayed with me through the ordeal, still slung across my body. I looked up at the window I had fallen from. It was closed, its glass intact, appearing as if it had never been opened. Above it rose 3 more floors of the hospital, windows reflecting the late afternoon sunlight, ordinary and mundane. Had I imagined it all? A panic attack, perhaps, brought on by isolation and the oppressive atmosphere of the abandoned building? But as I stood on shaky legs, I noticed something on my hand. A small, dark smear that hadn't been washed away by the grass and dew. As I watched, it seemed to move, ever so slightly, flowing against gravity toward my wrist. I wiped it frantically against my jeans, then checked my hand again. The mark was gone, but now there was a spot on my jeans. A stain that hadn't been there before, dark against the blue denim. I ran through the overgrown grounds, down the service road, not looking back, not stopping until I reached my car. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door and throw myself inside, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine and pulled away, I glanced in my rearview mirror for one last look at Ravensbrück Psychiatric Hospital. The building stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the dying sunlight like eyes watching my retreat. From this distance, it looked like any other abandoned building, lonely, decaying, but ultimately empty. But I knew better. Ravensbrück wasn't empty, and whatever resided within its walls, whether restless spirits, trauma embedded in brick and mortar, or something else entirely, it was hungry, patient, breathing. That was 3 days ago. I developed the photos yesterday, or tried to. Every frame was ruined, showing nothing but black smears across the paper, as if the images had melted. Even the digital backups on my memory card were corrupted, full of artifacts and strange distortions. My editor was disappointed but understanding. "These things happen with old equipment," he said. "Technical glitches." I didn't argue. I've been feeling strange since my visit to Ravensbrück. Tired, achy, with a persistent pain behind my left eye. Probably stress, or maybe I did injure myself in my panic, imagined or not. Last night, I woke at 3 a.m. to find my sheets damp with sweat, or something else. In the bathroom mirror, I examined my left eye, which had been bothering me all day. The white appeared slightly discolored, with tiny red lines radiating from the iris like cracks in glass. And for just a moment, as I leaned closer to the mirror, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface of my eye. A dark flicker, there and gone too quickly to be certain. I tell myself it was a trick of the light, a blood vessel, a floater in my vision. I almost believe it, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear it, that soft, rhythmic breathing that filled the halls of Ravensbrück. Only now, it seems to come from inside me, and I can't help but wonder what exactly came back with me from that place, hiding beneath my skin, pulsing behind my eye, waiting to spread, to grow, to breathe. The assignment seemed simple enough. Photograph the interior of Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital, closed for 15 years and slated for demolition next month. My editor wanted a photo spread on forgotten places for our local magazine. Nothing groundbreaking, just moody shots of peeling paint and abandoned medical equipment. Something about the transience of institutions, the fleeting nature of our monuments to healing. That sort of thing. I'd done dozens of urban exploration shoots before. Factories, schools, office buildings, they all had their own particular sadness, their own story of decline. But hospitals were different. Hospitals contained too much concentrated suffering, too many final breaths and shattered hopes pressed into their walls. I'd avoided them until now, but the deadline loomed, and the magazine needed the spread. So on a gray Tuesday afternoon in late October, I packed my camera bag, grabbed my press credentials, and drove out to the edge of town where Oak Ridge Memorial stood on its lonely hill, windows dark and vacant like the eye sockets of a skull. The hospital had been the pride of our small city once. Built in the 1930s, it had served as both a general hospital and, in its east wing, a psychiatric facility. The building itself was impressive, 6 stories of imposing brick and stone with Art Deco flourishes around the entrances. I remembered visiting my grandmother there as a child, the antiseptic smell making my nose wrinkle as we walked the polished corridors bringing her flowers. That smell was gone now, replaced by something else entirely. I parked in what had once been the visitor lot, my car the only sign of life in the cracked asphalt expanse. Security around the building was minimal, just a chain-link fence with several gaps where trespassers had pushed through. The city had given me permission to enter, so I used the main gate, its padlock hanging open from my contact's visit earlier in the week. The clouds hung low, threatening rain as I approached the main entrance. The front doors, once automatic sliding glass, had been replaced with plywood sheets, one of which was partially pried away. I slipped through the gap, flashlight in hand, camera bag secure against my hip. The lobby stretched before me, a cathedral to decay. What had once been a welcoming space of couches and reception desks was now a wasteland of fallen ceiling tiles, scattered papers, and upended furniture. Nature had begun its slow reclamation. Small saplings grew from cracks in the floor where rainwater had pooled, and vines crept in through broken windows. I took a few test shots, adjusting my camera settings to capture the dim, diffused light filtering through dirt-streaked windows. The air felt heavy, dense with dust and something else. Something that seemed to settle in my lungs with each breath. Not just mold or mildew, but something I couldn't place. Something old. As I moved deeper into the building, the outside light faded. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating dancing dust motes that swirled in patterns too deliberate to be caused by just my movement. I stopped, watching them move seemingly of their own accord. Just air currents, I told myself. Old buildings have strange ventilation patterns. The main corridor branched off in 3 directions. To the right was administration, to the left the emergency department, and straight ahead led to patient wings and, eventually, the psychiatric ward in the east wing. I decided to start with the emergency room. It would have the most interesting equipment remains. The ER waiting area was much like the lobby. Chairs overturned, magazines dissolved into pulp on the floor, a reception desk stripped of everything useful. But as I swept my flashlight across the room, I noticed something odd. On one wall, visible through flaking institutional green paint, dark stains formed a pattern that almost looked like handprints. Dozens of them, overlapping, as if many people had pressed their palms against the wall. I approached, thinking it might make an interesting shot. Up close, the stains didn't look like paint or water damage. They were slightly raised, with a rusty color that made my skin crawl. I reached out, almost touching one before pulling my hand back, a sudden revulsion overtaking me. A loud crash echoed from somewhere deep in the building. I jumped, heart hammering against my ribs, and spun around. The sound didn't repeat. After a moment, I laughed nervously at myself. Probably just something falling. These old buildings settle all the time. I moved through a set of double doors into what had been the treatment area. Curtain tracks hung from the ceiling, a few tattered privacy curtains still attached, swaying slightly though I couldn't feel any breeze. Most of the medical equipment was gone, sold off or stolen, but a few larger pieces remained. An X-ray machine loomed in one corner, its arm angled down like the head of some prehistoric beast. An overturned gurney lay on its side, one wheel spinning slowly, gradually coming to a stop as I watched. I frowned. For the wheel to be spinning, something had to have moved it recently. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded wrong, too flat, as if the air itself was swallowing the sound. No answer came, but as the echoes of my voice faded, I became aware of another sound. A soft, rhythmic noise, almost imperceptible. I held my breath, straining to hear. Thump thump, thump thump, like a heartbeat but not quite. More like breathing, the sound of air moving through a large space. I told myself it was just the wind finding its way through broken windows and empty elevator shafts. But the rhythm was too regular, too organic. I took a few photos of the treatment area, the flash momentarily banishing the shadows before they rushed back in, somehow deeper than before. Through my viewfinder, I noticed something I'd missed. Words scrawled on the wall behind the nursing station. I zoomed in, adjusted focus. They come through the walls at night. The handwriting was jagged, desperate. Not graffiti from teenage vandals, but something written with urgency. Below it, in different handwriting, I can hear them breathing. A chill ran through me. Urban explorers or homeless people who'd sheltered here, I reasoned. Playing pranks or suffering delusions in this admittedly creepy place. I'd seen similar things in abandoned buildings before, but not like this. Not with that writing that seemed to tremble on the wall. I checked my watch. Only 3:30 p.m., but already the light outside was fading as the storm clouds thickened. I had maybe 2 hours of workable natural light left. I decided to head upstairs to the patient rooms, then make my way to the psychiatric ward if time permitted. The main stairwell doors were chained shut. Fire code violations obviously not a concern anymore, so I found a service stairwell tucked behind what had been a small cafeteria. The stairs were concrete, utilitarian, and mostly intact. My footsteps echoed as I climbed, the sound bouncing back at me from above, creating a disorienting effect as if someone else was descending toward me. I paused on the landing between the first and second floors, listening. The footsteps stopped when I did. Just an echo, I was sure, but my heart had begun to beat faster anyway. That's when I noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. My breath fogged in front of my face, though it was October, not nearly cold enough for that. Cold spots in buildings weren't unusual, broken windows, missing insulation. But this felt different. A preternatural cold that seemed to press against my skin like something alive. I continued upward, moving faster now. The second floor corridor was lined with patient rooms, doors standing open or hanging from broken hinges. I poked my head into a few, all similar scenes of decay and abandonment. Hospital beds stripped of mattresses, side tables with drawers pulled out, ceiling tiles collapsed onto the floor. In one room, the walls were covered with writing, the same desperate scrawl I'd seen downstairs. Most of it was illegible, but certain phrases stood out. They're in the walls. Can't tell the doctors. No one believes me. They feed at night. A sudden gust of wind blew through the corridor, carrying with it the sound of rustling papers and something else. A whisper, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. I whirled around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. The corridor was empty. Anyone there? I called again, my voice sounding small and fragile. The whispering stopped. In the new silence, I could hear water dripping somewhere nearby. A steady plink, plink, plink. I followed the sound to a bathroom across the hall. The door hung open, revealing cracked tile floors and rusted fixtures. The sink faucet was dripping, a dark fluid that looked too thick to be water splashing into the stained basin. That was impossible. The water had been shut off for years. I backed away, bumping into the wall behind me. The impact sent vibrations through the surface, and for a brief moment, I felt something vibrate back, as if something inside the wall had shifted in response. My rational mind began cataloging explanations. Old pipes settling, rats in the walls, the building's structure adjusting to temperature changes. But another part of me, a more primitive part, recognized the movement as something else entirely. Something aware. I needed better light. The cloud-filtered sunlight and my flashlight weren't enough for the photos I needed. I dug in my bag for my portable LED light panel, a powerful tool that could illuminate a whole room. As I set it up on its small tripod in the corridor, pointing it into one of the more intact patient rooms, I felt a sense of control returning. Light would help. Light always helped. I switched on the panel, and brilliant white light flooded the space, chasing shadows into corners. I smiled, feeling my anxiety lessen as I began taking proper photos. The room had once been a double-occupancy patient room. 2 bed frames remained, one still with a stained mattress. For stands stood like silent sentinels beside each bed. As I framed a shot of the room, movement caught the corner of my eye, a shadow passing across the doorway behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Just my imagination, fueled by the oppressive atmosphere of this place. Yet as I turned back to my work, I noticed something had changed. On the far wall, above one of the beds, was a dark shape, a silhouette that looked like a person sitting upright on the bed. But there was no one there, just a shadow with no source. I blinked and the shape was gone. Get it together, I told myself. You've worked in creepy places before, but none like this. None that felt like they were watching me. I worked methodically for the next half hour, moving from room to room, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness that pressed in around me. The light panel helped, but its battery wouldn't last forever, and the shadows beyond its reach seemed to grow deeper by the minute. In one room, I found a patient chart still attached to the foot of a bed. Most of the pages were water-damaged, but the name was still visible: Elizabeth Reiner. Admitted 1973. The diagnosis was smudged, unreadable. At the bottom of one page, a note in different handwriting. Patient reports figures emerging from walls at night. Increased haloperidol dosage. I set the chart down, a new unease settling over me. I'd researched the hospital before coming, but hadn't found anything about unusual incidents or patient mistreatment. Every old psychiatric facility had its stories, of course, but Oak Ridge hadn't seemed remarkable in that regard. A metallic taste filled my mouth, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. As I exhaled, I thought I heard my breath echoed somewhere in the room, a soft exhalation that wasn't mine. "This is ridiculous," I said aloud, my voice startlingly loud. "Get the photos and get out." I decided to make my way toward the East Wing, the psychiatric ward. If any part of the hospital would yield dramatic photos, it would be there. I gathered my equipment, leaving the light panel on as I backed into the hallway. The corridor stretched before me, longer than I remembered, the shadows between light fixtures deeper, more absolute. And now I noticed something else. The walls seemed to have a subtle texture to them, a pattern of cracks that resembled veins. Thin, dark lines running through the plaster like a circulatory system. I stepped closer to one wall, examining it. The cracks weren't random. They formed networks, branching patterns that pulsed ever so slightly with my heartbeat. No, not with my heartbeat. Their rhythm was different, slower, older, just the building settling. Old places make noise. They shift and crack. But buildings don't breathe. And this one was breathing. I could feel it now in the subtle movement of air, in the way the dust motes danced in coordinated patterns, in the soft sounds that permeated the structure. The hospital wasn't just a building. It was an organism, and I was inside it. I backed away from the wall, nearly running now as I followed signs toward the East Wing. My light panel cast wild, jumping shadows as I moved, my own silhouette stretching and distorting on the walls around me. I passed through a set of heavy doors into what had once been a secure area. A nurse's station sat in the center, surrounded by patient rooms with observation windows. The psychiatric ward. Here, the destruction was more deliberate, not just decay but violence. Walls were gouged with deep scratches, furniture smashed rather than just overturned. The nurse's station was covered in dark stains. The countertop cracked down the middle as if struck with tremendous force. My flashlight beam caught something moving in one of the patient rooms. I froze, watching. A figure stood with its back to me, shoulders hunched, head hanging at an unnatural angle. It was difficult to make out details in the gloom, but it appeared to be wearing a hospital gown, the fabric darkened with stains. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. "I'm just a photographer. I have permission to be here." The figure didn't move. It stood motionless, a silhouette against the far wall of the room. I raised my camera, zooming in to get a better look through the viewfinder. Through the lens, I could see that what I'd taken for a person was actually a hospital gown hanging from a pipe that protruded from the ceiling, creating a human-like shape in the dim light. I laughed shakily, lowering the camera. But as I looked again with my naked eye, the gown was moving, swaying slightly as if someone had just brushed past it, or as if someone invisible were wearing it. I backed away, bumping into the nurse's station. My hand came down on something wet. I looked down to see a dark fluid coating my palm, the same substance I'd seen dripping from the faucet upstairs. It wasn't water. It was too viscous, too dark. I wiped my hand frantically on my jeans, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to leave, to run, to get out of this place. But another part, a part one didn't recognize, wanted to stay, wanted to see, wanted to understand what was happening here. That's when I noticed the records. A metal filing cabinet behind the nurse's station had been pried open, folders and papers scattered across the floor. Most were too water-damaged to read, but one file lay open atop the mess, its pages relatively intact. I picked it up with trembling hands, playing my flashlight across the text. It was an incident report from 1974. 5 patients had died in a single night, all in the East Wing. The cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure for each, but a handwritten note at the bottom of the report told a different story. Patients found with extensive subcutaneous hemorrhaging. Walls in all 5 rooms showed evidence of movement. Request for investigation denied by administration. Staff who reported breathing walls placed on administrative leave. The report was signed by the chief resident, Dr. Malcolm Ward. I dropped the file, my breath coming in short gasps now. The walls around me seemed to pulse in time with my panic, the vein-like cracks widening and contracting. And now I could hear it clearly, the sound I'd been hearing since I entered the building but couldn't identify. Breathing. Deep, slow breaths that resonated through the structure itself. A loud crack came from above, and I looked up to see the ceiling tiles bulging downward, as if something heavy was pressing on them from above. One tile split open, a thick, dark fluid beginning to drip through. I scrambled backwards, grabbing my camera bag but leaving the light panel. The fluid dripped faster now, spattering on the floor where I'd been standing moments before. It hissed as it hit the ground, eating into the linoleum like acid. I ran, back through the heavy doors, down the corridor that now seemed to narrow as I moved, the walls pressing in. The veins in the plaster grew more pronounced, pulsing visibly now. I could hear whispers all around me, coming from inside the walls, hundreds of voices speaking in urgent, panicked tones. They're coming through. Don't let them touch you. The doctors knew. They always knew. I reached the stairwell and practically threw myself down the steps, stumbling and catching myself on the railing. Behind me, I heard a wet, tearing sound, like flesh ripping open. The stairs beneath my feet began to feel soft, yielding like tissue. I looked down to see the concrete steps transforming, the surface becoming slick and organic. The walls of the stairwell pulsed around me, the paint cracking to reveal something red and raw underneath. The hospital wasn't just alive. It was changing, transforming. I burst through the door at the bottom of the stairs, finding myself back in the main corridor. Darkness had fallen outside, the storm clouds blocking what little daylight remained. My flashlight beam seemed weaker now, barely penetrating the gloom that filled the building. A low moan echoed through the corridor, a sound of pain so profound it made my chest ache in sympathy. It was coming from the direction of the emergency room, and it sounded like many voices joined as one. I turned toward the exit, determined to escape, but stopped short. The lobby ahead was no longer empty. Figures stood in the gloom, silhouettes that weren't quite human. Their proportions were wrong, limbs too long, heads misshapen. They swayed slightly, as if moved by an unfelt breeze, or as if they were appendages of something larger. I backed away, turning to flee in the other direction. As I moved, my flashlight beam swept across the figures, illuminating them for a split second. They weren't people at all, but protrusions from the walls and floor, the building itself forming human-like shapes from its own substance. Faces pressed outward from the walls, mouths open in silent screams. The moaning grew louder, joined now by a wet, slithering sound. I ran blindly, no longer caring where I was going as long as it was away from those things. I found myself in what had once been the hospital cafeteria, a large space with overturned tables and chairs. In the center of the room stood a figure that made me stop dead in my tracks. Unlike the malformed protrusions in the lobby, this was clearly once human. A man in a white doctor's coat, his back to me. He stood perfectly still, head bowed as if examining something on the floor. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The figure turned slowly. Where his face should have been was only a dark cavity, a hole that seemed to go back forever. From the depths of that impossible hole came a voice, not spoken aloud but somehow inside my head. "You shouldn't be here. Not yet. You're not ready." I stumbled backward, raising my camera in a futile gesture of self-defense. The flash went off, momentarily illuminating the room. In that instant of brightness, I saw that the figure wasn't alone. The walls behind him were covered with faces. Patients, doctors, nurses, all partially emerged from the surface as if the wall was a membrane they were pushing through. And all of them were looking at me. The flash faded, plunging the room back into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died. In the new blackness, I heard movement, the sound of many bodies shifting at once. They were coming toward me. I turned and ran, colliding with tables and chairs in the darkness. My hip struck something hard, pain shooting down my leg, but I kept moving. Behind me, the slithering sound grew louder, accompanied by the sound of tearing fabric or tearing flesh. I found a door and burst through it, finding myself in a kitchen area. Moonlight filtered through a high window, providing just enough illumination to navigate by. I weaved through abandoned cooking equipment, looking for another exit. A rhythmic thumping sound came from the walls all around me, like a massive heartbeat. The floor beneath my feet began to soften, my shoes sinking slightly into what should have been solid tile. The air grew thick, humid, smelling of copper and salt, like blood. I spotted a service door at the far end of the kitchen and lunged for it, yanking it open. Beyond was a loading dock, and beyond that, the parking lot where my car waited. Freedom. I was halfway across the kitchen when the floor erupted in front of me. Something pushed up through the tiles, a column of glistening, organic material that rose to the height of a person before bending toward me. At its top was something like a head, but with no features except a gaping cavity that opened and closed like a mouth. It wasn't alone. All around me, the floor and walls were rupturing, similar forms emerging. The hospital wasn't just alive, it was hungry. I changed direction, veering toward a dumbwaiter set into the wall. It was my only chance. I pried open the small door and found, to my relief, that the car was present. It would be a tight fit, but I had no choice. I squeezed into the small space, pulling the door shut behind me just as one of the creatures reached for me. I felt the dumbwaiter car drop suddenly, plunging down its shaft faster than it was ever designed to move. I braced myself against the walls of the tiny compartment, feeling them pulse against my back. The car crashed to a stop at the bottom level, the basement. The impact jolted through me, but nothing seemed broken. I pushed open the door and tumbled out into darkness. My phone was still in my pocket. I activated its flashlight, weaker than my proper torch but better than nothing. I was in some kind of storage area, the beam illuminating shelves of old medical supplies and equipment. But something was wrong. The room didn't look abandoned like the floors above. These supplies weren't covered in 15 years of dust. Some packages were open, items recently removed. Someone or something had been using this space. A noise came from behind a row of shelves, a shuffling, dragging sound. I swung my phone's light toward it but saw nothing. The sound moved, circling around me. Then a voice spoke, a real voice this time, raspy with disuse but human. "You shouldn't have come here." A figure stepped into the beam of light. An old man in tattered scrubs, his face gaunt, eyes sunken. He might have been 60 or 80, it was hard to tell. His skin had an unhealthy pallor, almost translucent in places. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Dr. Ward," he replied. "Malcolm Ward. I used to work upstairs." The name from the incident report, but that was 50 years ago. If this was the same man, he'd be ancient now. "What's happening here?" I asked. "What is this place?" He laughed, a hollow sound. "It was supposed to be a place of healing. That's what we all thought. But the building had other ideas." "Buildings don't have ideas," I said, though my experience over the last hour suggested otherwise. "This one does. It's been here longer than the hospital. We just built over it." He stepped closer, and I could see now that his scrubs were stained with the same dark fluid I'd seen upstairs. It was dormant for centuries. We woke it up with our pain, our suffering. Hospitals are full of it, you know, full of death and fear. "What are you talking about?" I backed away, but he followed. "It feeds on it, grows stronger." The walls started breathing first. Then they started taking people in. His eyes were wild now, his hands gesturing erratically. I tried to tell them, filed reports. They said I was crazy, overworked, put me on leave. So you came back, I whispered, understanding dawning. You've been living down here. He nodded, watching, learning its patterns. It needs to feed regularly. I help it sometimes, bring it what it needs. In return, it lets me live, lets me be part of it without being consumed. A chill ran through me as I realized what he was saying. You bring it people? His smile was terrible to behold. Urban explorers, homeless looking for shelter. Like you, they come inside curious. They don't leave. I lunged for the door I'd spotted behind him, what looked like a corridor that might lead to an exit, but he was surprisingly fast for his age, blocking my path. You can't leave, he said, almost apologetically. It's already tasted you, marked you, the breath. Did you feel it? The cold spots? That's how it chooses. Behind me, I heard the wet, slithering sound again. Something was coming down the dumbwaiter shaft. More than one something. Dr. Ward's eyes widened, looking past me. It's too late. They're coming for you. He backed away, disappearing into the shadows between shelving units. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do. I spun around as the dumbwaiter door burst open. What emerged wasn't a discrete entity but a mass of writhing tissue. Like dozens of limbs and torsos fused together, faces half-formed and then reabsorbed into the pulsing mass. It oozed out of the small opening, somehow compressing and expanding at the same time, defying physical laws. I ran, no longer caring which direction led out, just needing to be away from that abomination. I found myself in a corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits. Emergency lights provided dim illumination. Apparently the basement had backup power the upper floors lacked. Behind me, the slithering mass pursued, moving faster than should have been possible for something so ungainly. I could hear voices emanating from it, dozens of them, crying out in pain or calling my name in a horrible chorus. The corridor turned sharply, revealing a set of double doors marked morgue. I pushed through them, hoping to find another exit on the far side. Instead, I found myself in a large, tiled room lined with body storage units. Examination tables stood in the center, their steel surfaces reflecting the emergency lights. There was no other exit. I was trapped. The doors burst open behind me, the mass of flesh filling the doorway. It pulsed forward, stretching toward me like a grotesque amoeba. Faces formed on its surface. Some I recognized from the walls upstairs, others new. All were contorted in agony. I backed up until I hit the wall of storage units. There was nowhere left to go. The mass paused as if considering me. Then it spoke. Not with one voice, but with many. A cacophony of whispers and screams that somehow formed words. Join us. Become part of the whole. Your pain will be our pain. Your fear will feed us. A tendril extended from the mass, reaching for my face. I ducked, scrambling sideways along the wall. My hand brushed against something, a fire alarm pull station, ancient but possibly still functional. Without hesitation, I yanked it down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a deafening siren split the air, and sprinklers in the ceiling activated, spraying water across the room. The mass of flesh recoiled, its many voices rising in a shriek of pain as the water hit it. Steam rose where the droplets made contact, and the creature began to retreat. I didn't wait to see more. I dashed past the contracting mass, back into the corridor. Water was pouring from sprinklers here too, making the concrete floor slick. I ran blindly, following the corridor as it curved and branched. Behind me, alarms continued to wail. The sprinklers must have triggered a full building fire response. That meant firefighters would be coming, people who might help me, but also people who would be in danger if they entered. I had to find an exit, had to warn them. The corridor ended at a stairwell, different from the one I'd used earlier. I took the stairs 2 at a time, water cascading down from the upper levels. As I climbed, I felt the building shudder around me, not like an earthquake, but like a creature in pain. The stairwell led to a small vestibule with a door marked emergency exit. I slammed into the push bar, and the door swung open. Cold night air rushed in, sweet and clean after the fetid atmosphere inside. I stumbled out onto wet grass, the rain having started while I was inside. In the distance, I could hear sirens, fire trucks responding to the alarm. I moved away from the building on unsteady legs, turning to look back at Oak Ridge Memorial. In the moonlight breaking through the storm clouds, the hospital looked almost normal, just an abandoned building on a hill. But now I could see what I hadn't noticed before. The subtle wrongness of its proportions, the way certain windows seemed to bulge outward, the organic quality of its silhouette against the night sky. And I knew that inside, behind those dark windows, the walls were breathing, waiting, hungry. I don't know if the fire department found anything unusual when they arrived. I didn't stay to find out. I ran to my car and drove away, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I never delivered those photos. My camera and light panel remained inside, and nothing could compel me to go back for them. I told my editor there had been an accident, that I'd been forced to flee without my equipment. He was angry, but I didn't care. Sometimes at night, I wake up to the sound of breathing that isn't mine. I feel the walls of my bedroom watching me, and I wonder if a part of that place followed me home. If the building marked me, as Dr. Ward said. And sometimes, when I press my hand against the wall beside my bed, I swear I can feel it pulse in response. A slow, patient rhythm, waiting for me to let my guard down. Buildings don't breathe. They don't hunger. They don't consume. But Oak Ridge Memorial does. And I fear that one day, it will finish what it started when I walked through its doors. One day it will come for me, and this time there will be no escape. The email had seemed straightforward enough. 6 hours of photography work at the old Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital, documenting the building before its scheduled demolition next month. The Historical Society wanted a visual record of the place, a grim chapter in local history, but history nonetheless. As a freelance photographer struggling to make rent, I couldn't afford to be picky about assignments. Besides, I had photographed abandoned buildings before. The urbex community loved my work. I knew how to capture the peculiar beauty in decay. That's what I told myself as I drove through the wrought iron gates that hung askew from crumbling stone pillars. Just another job. Just another empty building. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway as I parked my car at the foot of the main entrance steps. Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital stood against the skyline like a jagged wound. A massive Victorian structure with a central administration building flanked by 2 sprawling wings. Once white, the exterior had aged to a mottled gray, streaked with rust from the gutters and stained by decades of rainfall. Despite its dilapidated state, the building maintained a certain dignity, like an elderly person too proud to acknowledge their failing health. I checked my watch, 4:37 p.m. I had roughly 3 hours of decent light left. My contact at the Historical Society had assured me the electricity was still connected for the security system, but I didn't want to test my luck after dark. I grabbed my camera bag, tripod, and the large flashlight from my trunk, then trudged up the cracked concrete steps to the entrance. The key I'd been given was heavy and ornate, nothing like modern keys. It turned with difficulty in the lock, the mechanism inside groaning as if I had woken it from a long slumber. The massive wooden door swung inward with a low, mournful creak that seemed to echo through the entire building. I stepped into the main foyer, and immediately the temperature dropped by what felt like 10 degrees. October in New England was already chilly, but inside Blackwood, the cold had a different quality, dense and penetrating. I zipped my jacket higher and switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through dust motes that swirled in the still air. The foyer retained traces of its former grandeur. A wide marble staircase curved upward to the second floor, its balustrade carved with intricate patterns now obscured by grime. A reception desk stood directly ahead, papers still scattered across its surface, as if the staff had simply walked away mid-shift. Above, a chandelier hung precariously, most of its crystal pendants missing, the remainder coated in decades of dust. I set down my equipment and took out my camera, fitting it with a wide-angle lens. The Historical Society wanted comprehensive documentation, so I started with establishing shots of the main entrance. Through my viewfinder, I noticed details that had escaped my initial observation. the water damage spreading across the ceiling like a dark cancer, the faded outlines on the wall where portraits had once hung, and most disquieting, deep gouges in the wooden reception desk, as if someone had repeatedly driven something sharp into its surface. The click and whir of my camera shutter seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. I reviewed the images on my screen, adjusting settings for the low light conditions. As I worked, the peculiar feeling that had settled in my stomach upon entering intensified. It wasn't unfamiliar. Old buildings often had a certain presence, an accumulated weight of history that could feel oppressive. But this was different, more immediate, as if the building itself was aware of my intrusion. I dismissed the thought and consulted the floor plan I'd been provided. The East Wing had housed patient rooms and treatment facilities. The West Wing contained staff quarters, offices, and what had once been a state-of-the-art surgical suite. The basement level held the morgue, laundry, and mechanical systems. I decided to work methodically from top to bottom, starting with the administrative offices on the second floor. As I ascended the marble staircase, I couldn't shake the impression that the temperature continued to drop with each step. My breath didn't quite fog, but I could feel the chill air burning in my lungs. At the top of the stairs, a long corridor stretched in both directions, doorways lining both sides. Wallpaper, once presumably elegant, now hung in moldering strips, revealing cracked plaster beneath. The floor was littered with fallen ceiling tiles, scattered papers, and unidentifiable debris. I began photographing the administrative offices, moving from room to room. Most contained little more than decaying furniture and filing cabinets, their contents long since removed or destroyed by water damage. In what appeared to have been the director's office, I found a large oak desk facing floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the hospital grounds. Despite decades of neglect, the view remained impressive. Rolling hills now overgrown, and beyond them, dense forest stretching to the horizon. As I adjusted my tripod for a shot of the desk against the backdrop of the windows, I noticed an object that seemed out of place among the general decay. A leather-bound book, its cover relatively unmarked by time. I set my camera down and picked up the volume, curious about how it had survived when everything else had deteriorated so severely. The journal, for that's what it was, belonged to someone named Dr. Thomas Harrow, according to the nameplate inside the cover. The handwriting started neat and clinical, detailing patient treatments and hospital operations, but as I flipped through the pages, it became increasingly erratic. The final entries were barely legible scrawls, filled with references to the patients hearing the voices from below and noises in the walls. The last page contained a single sentence, underlined multiple times. "It's in the basement. God help us all." I closed the book, suddenly aware of how completely silent the building had become. No creaking of timbers, no scuttling of rodents, no distant dripping of water. Just a thick, expectant silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I returned the journal to the desk, an irrational part of me not wanting to disturb whatever balance existed in this decaying place. Back in the corridor, I noticed something I had missed on my way in. A black smudge on the peeling wallpaper opposite the director's office. Moving closer, I realized it wasn't a smudge at all, but words written in what looked like charcoal. "They never left us. We never left them." The handwriting didn't match the journal's. This was larger, more desperate, the letters uneven as if written by someone in a hurry or distress. I took several photos, the flash illuminating other, fainter markings I hadn't initially noticed. Similar messages appeared at irregular intervals down the corridor. Listen to the walls.
The doctor sleep.
Below is where they keep us. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the cold. Old psychiatric hospitals were magnets for vandals and thrill seekers. These writings were undoubtedly the work of trespassers looking to add to the building's eerie reputation. Yet something about the messages felt too specific, too consistent in their references to something below. I continued photographing the second floor, working my way through what had been offices, meeting rooms, and record storage. In the last room at the end of the corridor, I found another anomaly. A chair positioned in the center of the room, facing the corner. Nothing else, just the chair, its wooden frame less deteriorated than the other furniture I'd encountered. It seemed deliberately placed. As I raised my camera to photograph it, a sound broke the silence. A soft, prolonged scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It came from somewhere below me, muffled by distance but unmistakable. I froze, listening intently. The sound didn't repeat, but my heart continued to pound. I told myself it was the building settling, or perhaps an animal that had found its way inside. Urban Exploration 101. Old buildings make noises. It meant nothing. Still, I decided to continue to the east wing rather than proceed downstairs just yet. If anyone else was in the building, squatters or teenagers looking for a thrill, I wanted to maintain distance. The east wing had housed the patients, and it showed in the architecture. The wide corridor was lined with doors at regular intervals, most standing open to reveal small, Spartan rooms. Unlike modern hospital rooms with their emphasis on patient comfort, these spaces were designed for containment. Each contained the rusted frame of a bed bolted to the floor, a sink, and a window covered with heavy mesh rather than bars. A more humane approach to security, according to the historical briefing I'd been given. I photographed several of the rooms, noting the variations that indicated different security levels. Some had additional restraint points on the walls and beds. Others had doors that locked only from the outside. The rooms at the far end of the wing were the most disturbing. Padded cells with the padding now hanging in moldy shreds, and observation windows set high in the doors. In one such room, I discovered my first truly inexplicable finding. The padding on the walls had been torn away in one corner, revealing the plaster beneath. And there, scratched deeply into the plaster, was a crude diagram that resembled the layout of the hospital itself. In the basement area, a circular shape had been drawn and filled in with such force that the plaster had crumbled away in places. Around this circle, the same phrase had been etched repeatedly. They feed it, they feed it, they feed it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The vandalism theory was becoming harder to maintain. This was not the work of casual trespassers. The depth of the scratches in the solid plaster would have required hours of determined effort. I was about to photograph the etching when a blast of frigid air hit me with such force that I gasped. It wasn't a natural draft. The air seemed to circulate around me deliberately, carrying with it a smell so foul that my eyes watered. A mixture of formaldehyde, rot, and something metallic like old blood. The smell disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving me disoriented and nauseated. The silence resumed, but now it felt charged, as if the building was holding its breath. I checked my watch, 6:15 p.m. The light outside the mesh-covered windows had dimmed considerably. I should have been wrapping up, heading back to my car while there was still some daylight. Instead, I found myself drawn deeper into the hospital's maze. I returned to the main staircase and descended to the first floor. The grand foyer where I had entered seemed different somehow, the shadows darker, the dust motes more agitated. I paused at the reception desk, considering whether to pack up and return another day to complete the assignment. As I deliberated, a soft click echoed through the foyer, the unmistakable sound of a door closing somewhere in the distance. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Hello!" My voice sounded small and swallowed by the emptiness. No response. "I'm just a photographer," I called out, louder this time. "I'm supposed to be here. I have permission." Still nothing. Yet the silence now felt like a lie, as if the building was deliberately concealing other sounds from me. I should have left. Every instinct told me to grab my gear and rush back to the safety of my car and the world beyond those wrought iron gates. Instead, I found myself drawn toward the source of the sound, a doorway beneath the main staircase that, according to my floor plan, led to the basement. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. I didn't remember seeing it open earlier. My flashlight beam seemed weaker as I directed it toward the stairwell, the darkness beyond somehow thicker, more resistant to illumination. The steps were concrete, utilitarian, descending at a steep angle into blackness. I took the first step down, and the temperature plummeted. My breath now clouded visibly in front of me, and the cold had a biting quality that penetrated my clothing. The smell returned. Chemical and organic decay mingled together. growing stronger as I descended. 13 steps took me to a landing where the stairwell turned back on itself. Another 13 steps, and I reached the basement level. The beam of my flashlight revealed a long, low-ceilinged corridor with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. Doors lined both sides, their paint peeling to reveal metal beneath. Fire doors, designed to contain disasters. The floor was bare concrete, stained dark in some areas. The air down here was not just cold but damp, carrying a mineral smell like wet stone. According to the floor plan, the morgue was to the left, while the mechanical rooms and laundry facilities were to the right. I turned left, drawn by a professional obligation to be thorough in my documentation, despite the growing dread that had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. The morgue doors stood wide open. Inside, stainless steel examination tables were still bolted to the floor, their surfaces stained with unknown substances. The wall opposite contained the cold storage units, small doors where bodies would have been kept. Most stood open, revealing empty compartments, but 3 remained closed. I avoided looking directly at them as I photographed the room. The fluorescent light fixtures overhead were long dead, but my flash illuminated the space in harsh bursts that made the stains on the tables seem to shift and move in the intervals of darkness. I worked quickly, focusing on the composition rather than the content of each shot. As I turned to leave, a metallic groan emanated from one of the closed storage units. The sound was so unexpected that I dropped my flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly across walls and ceiling before settling on one of the closed compartments. In the moment before I retrieved it, I could have sworn I saw the handle move slightly. I snatched up the flashlight and backed out of the morgue, heart thundering so loudly I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Air pressure changes, old mechanisms finally giving way, my own overactive imagination. But all I could think of was getting back upstairs. As I turned to retrace my steps to the stairwell, I noticed something different about the corridor. A door that I was certain had been closed when I passed it was now standing open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. According to the floor plan, this area should have contained mechanical systems, boilers, generators, water heaters, but the passage didn't appear on my map. Despite my fear, curiosity pulled me forward. The passage was narrow, forcing me to turn sideways in some places. The walls were raw stone rather than finished concrete like the rest of the basement. This was older than the hospital above, perhaps part of an earlier foundation. The air grew increasingly dense and hard to breathe, thick with that same chemical organic smell, now so strong it made my eyes water. The passage ended at a round chamber about 20 feet in diameter. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all the same rough-hewn stone. In the center of the room stood a circular stone structure that resembled a well, about 4 feet high and 6 feet across. The top was covered with a heavy stone lid, secured in place with iron bands that had rusted to a deep red-brown. The room contained nothing else, no furniture, no equipment, nothing to indicate its purpose. Yet it had a feeling of deliberate construction, of intent. The circular well in particular seemed to draw both eye and mind. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, as if something was pushing against the inside of my skull. I raised my camera, determined to document this anomaly and then get out. As I focused on the well, my viewfinder captured something I hadn't seen with my naked eye. Symbols carved into the stone lid, partially obscured by rust and grime. They weren't letters from any alphabet I recognized, but complex interlocking shapes that seemed to shift and writhe as I tried to focus on them. The click of my shutter echoed strangely in the chamber, the sound distorting as if passing through water. I lowered the camera and leaned closer to the well, trying to make sense of the symbols. As I did, a vibration passed through the stone beneath my feet, subtle at first, then increasing until I could feel it in my bones. A low humming sound filled the air, just at the threshold of hearing. And then, unmistakably, something knocked from beneath the stone lid. 3 distinct impacts precisely spaced. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a sound like stone grinding against stone. The lid moved, just a fraction of an inch, but enough for a thin wisp of black vapor to escape from beneath it. The vapor curled upward like smoke but moved with purpose, forming shapes in the air that almost resembled letters before dissipating. The temperature in the room plummeted further, my breath now forming thick clouds. The knocking intensified, no longer coming just from the well but from the walls around me, the floor beneath my feet, the ceiling above, as if the entire chamber had become a membrane separating me from something vast and terrible. I turned and ran, stumbling back through the narrow passage, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the stone walls. Behind me, the knocking grew louder, faster, more insistent, a demanding, hungry sound. I burst back into the main basement corridor and sprinted toward the stairs, no longer caring about the assignment or my equipment, focused only on escape. As I rounded the corner to the stairwell, I collided with something solid that hadn't been there before. I fell backward, my flashlight flying from my hand and going out as it hit the floor. In the sudden darkness, I scrambled backward on hands and knees, gasping for breath in the cold, thick air. A faint phosphorescence began to emanate from the figure standing between me and the stairs. Not enough to illuminate, just enough to suggest a human silhouette. But the proportions were wrong. The arms hung too low, the head sat at an unnatural angle on shoulders that seemed too narrow for the torso's bulk. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it raised one elongated arm and pointed. Not at me, but past me, back toward the round chamber and the well within it. "No," I said, finding my voice. "I'm leaving. Now." The figure drifted closer, its outline becoming more defined. I could make out the suggestion of a hospital gown, hanging in tatters from an emaciated frame. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness interrupted by two faint points of light where eyes might be. Spoke, not with a voice, but directly into my mind. The words weren't in any language I understood, yet their meaning penetrated my consciousness. "It stirs. It hungers. It remembers you." With a surge of terror-fueled adrenaline, I lunged for my flashlight, found it, and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. The stairwell was clear. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning with the effort. Behind me, the knocking sound had become a continuous vibration that I could feel through the concrete. At the top of the stairs, I burst through the door into the main foyer, which now lay in deep twilight shadow. I grabbed my camera bag and tripod, not taking time to pack properly, and made for the main entrance. The massive front door that had opened so reluctantly earlier now seemed stuck fast. I pushed with all my strength, then pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rising, I turned to find another exit. The knocking had followed me upstairs, now seeming to come from all directions at once. The walls of the foyer appeared to pulse subtly, as if breathing. The temperature continued to drop, frost now forming on the marble floor beneath my feet. I spotted a side door that led to what had once been an administrative office with its own exterior entrance. I rushed through, relief flooding me as I saw moonlight through dusty windows. But as I reached for the door handle, the overhead light fixture, which should have been long dead, sputtered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. Reflected in the window glass, I saw not only my own terrified face, but the room behind me transformed. No longer decayed and abandoned, it appeared as it might have in the hospital's heyday. Desk polished, papers neatly arranged, even a typewriter poised as if waiting for use. And behind the desk sat a figure in a doctor's white coat, head bent over paperwork. As I watched in the reflection, paralyzed with shock, the figure slowly raised its head. Its face was a blur, features constantly shifting and reforming like smoke and wind. It lifted a hand as if in greeting, and I saw that its fingers ended not in nails but in scalpel blades that gleamed in the yellow light. I wrenched the door open and stumbled outside, the frigid night air hitting my lungs like a physical blow. I ran down the service stairs, across the overgrown lawn, and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked back at the hospital. Every window was lit now, not with electric light, but with a pulsing, organic radiance that reminded me of bioluminescent creatures in the ocean's depths. Silhouettes moved behind some of the windows, misshapen things that only approximated human form. And above it all, emerging from what must have been the hospital's roof, rose a column of that same black vapor I had seen escape from the well, now expanding into the night sky like an inverted tornado. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning on gravel, and sped down the driveway. As I approached the gates, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The black vapor had formed a shape against the night sky, an enormous face with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth that seemed to be descending toward the hospital, preparing to swallow it whole. I didn't stop driving until I was 30 miles away. Even then, I pulled over only because my hands were shaking too badly to continue. I sat there on the shoulder of the highway, gasoline light blinking, and tried to make sense of what I had experienced. My camera. I still had my camera. With trembling fingers, I retrieved it from the passenger seat and reviewed the images I had taken. The foyer, the administrative offices, the patient rooms, all appeared as I remembered them, decayed and abandoned. But when I reached the photos of the morgue, my blood ran cold. Where the stainless steel tables should have been, the images showed stone altars, stained with dark substances that couldn't possibly be rust. And in the background, barely visible in the shadows, were figures in medical garb, their faces blurred beyond recognition. The final image, the one I had taken of the well in the round chamber, showed the stone lid removed. What emerged from the opening was not vapor but something solid yet impossible to define. A mass of writhing shapes that seemed to continue endlessly, as if the well contained an entire universe of motion and malevolence. 3 days later, I delivered a carefully edited selection of photos to the Historical Society. Sanitized images showing only the architectural features they had requested. I claimed that water damage and poor lighting had rendered many of my shots unusable. They were disappointed but accepted the explanation. I never mentioned what I saw in the basement, never told them about the well or the figures or the black vapor rising into the night sky, never shared the unedited photos that still reside on a hard drive locked in my safe. But sometimes, in my dreams, I return to that round chamber. In these nightmares, I'm not alone. Dr. Harrow is there, and others, doctors and nurses whose faces I can never quite see. They stand around the well as I approach, parting to make room for me. They tell me without speaking that I belong with them now, that I've seen what lies beneath, and that makes me part of Blackwood forever. And sometimes, I wake from these dreams to find frost on my bedroom windows, even in summer. And in the condensation, if I look quickly before it melts, I can make out words in a hand not my own. We're still waiting. The patients become the doctors. The doctors become the patients. And below, it grows stronger with each passing day. I've moved twice since that assignment, changed my phone number, deleted my professional website. But deep down, I know it doesn't matter. Geography is no barrier to what dwells beneath Blackwood. Distance is meaningless to something that exists partially outside our reality. I've researched the hospital's history extensively since then, looking for any mention of the chamber or the well. The official records mention nothing, but in obscure journals and personal accounts of former staff, I found references, always oblique, always fearful, to treatment procedures conducted in a specialized facility beneath the hospital. Procedures from which no patient ever returned. The demolition of Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital was scheduled for last month. The night before machinery was to begin tearing down the structure, the entire building collapsed in on itself. News reports called it a sinkhole, a tragic result of poor foundation maintenance. 3 demolition workers who had been doing preliminary assessments inside were never found. I know better. The well is no longer contained. Whatever dwelt beneath the hospital is free. And sometimes, I think I can hear it, a faint knocking at the edge of perception. 3 distinct impacts precisely spaced, closer each time, waiting to be let in. It started with a job. A simple job, really. I'd been hired to photograph the interior of the old West Haven Psychiatric Hospital before its scheduled demolition next month. The real estate developers needed documentation for their archives, nothing unusual for an architectural photographer like me. I'd done dozens of similar assignments for various clients. Abandoned factories, condemned schools, forgotten monuments to bygone eras. This was just another paycheck. The morning I arrived was unremarkable. Early October brought a crisp edge to the air, turning leaves from green to amber and crimson. I parked my car at the base of the long, winding driveway leading up to West Haven. The facility had been closed for nearly 20 years, but the imposing Victorian-era main building maintained a certain dignity despite its decay. 5 stories of weathered brick with ornate cornices and tall, narrow windows stared down at me from atop the hill. Wings extended from both sides like arms preparing to embrace or trap anyone who approached. I checked my equipment one last time. Camera, wide-angle lens, tripod, flash, spare batteries. I'd brought a powerful flashlight too, knowing the electricity would long since have been disconnected. My client had arranged for a security guard to meet me and unlock the main entrance, but as I climbed the cracked concrete steps to the entrance, I found only a key in an envelope taped to the massive wooden doors. A handwritten note read, "Emergency called guard away. Lock up when finished. Drop key in mail slot at security office downtown." Inconvenient, but not unprecedented. I shrugged, removed the key, and pushed it into the tarnished brass lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled. The heavy door swung inward with a low, mournful creak that seemed to echo endlessly down unseen corridors. The entrance hall was cavernous. Dim light filtered through filthy windows and illuminated swirling dust motes in pale, diffused beams. The air hit me first, stagnant and thick with the metallic scent of corroded pipes, crumbling plaster, and something else underneath. Something organic and vaguely medicinal. The smell of neglect with a lingering trace of its institutional past. I took a few test shots without my flash, letting the natural light create dramatic shadows across the checkered marble floor. The acoustics were strange. Every footstep bounced back at me from multiple directions, as if the building itself was mocking my movements. The click of my camera shutter seemed unnaturally loud. My plan was methodical. Work my way through the main floor, then ascend level by level, documenting representative rooms, architectural features, and anything of particular interest. I'd allow 6 hours, more than enough time to thoroughly cover the building before daylight began to fade. The first hour passed uneventfully. I photographed the expansive lobby with its grand but rotting reception desk, several administrative offices with papers still scattered across the floor, and a day room where broken furniture lay overturned. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust and debris. Water damage had caused portions of the ceiling to collapse in places, creating irregular stains like massive Rorschach patterns on the walls and floors. It was when I moved deeper into the east wing that I first felt it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that raised the fine hairs on my neck. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, though there were no windows open, no obvious drafts. I attributed it to the building's poor insulation and continued working, though I found myself moving more quickly, less interested in the artistic compositions I normally prioritized. The staff dining hall contained long tables still arranged in neat rows, metal chairs toppled and rusting. In one corner, a single chair remained upright, facing the wall. Someone's idea of a joke, I assumed, though it struck me as a strangely melancholy tableau. I photographed it anyway. I'd worked in enough abandoned buildings to recognize the usual signs of trespassers. Graffiti, beer cans, occasional evidence of squatters. West Haven showed surprisingly little of this. No spray-painted tags on the walls, no scattered debris from urban explorers or teenage drinkers. The building seemed untouched in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if something had been keeping people away. Just past noon, I found the patient wards. Long corridors stretched in both directions, lined with identical doors set at regular intervals. Most stood partially open, revealing small, Spartan rooms beyond. I entered one at random. A metal bed frame remained bolted to the floor, its mattress long since removed. A sink hung from one wall, its porcelain cracked and stained rust red. The window was covered with a heavy metal grate, and though years of grime obscured the glass, weak sunlight created a grid-like pattern on the dusty floor. I was adjusting my camera settings when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound from somewhere down the hallway. My first thought, raccoons or rats, common residents of abandoned structures. Yet something about the rhythm seemed wrong for an animal. Too measured, too deliberate. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded flat and muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. No response came, and the shuffling had stopped. After a moment's hesitation, I returned to my work, though I found myself listening more intently now, attention divided between my viewfinder and the doorway. By the time I'd finished documenting the first floor, I'd convinced myself I was alone. The building settled and shifted around me, creating an orchestra of small sounds. Creaking wood, dripping water, the occasional skittering of what I presumed were small creatures in the walls. Nothing unusual for a structure of this age and condition. I ascended the grand staircase to the second floor, my flashlight beam cutting through the increasing gloom. The windows here were smaller, admitting less light, and the corridors seemed narrower than those below. More patient rooms, a nurse's station, medication dispensary, and a large therapy room with chairs arranged in a circle, frozen in time as if awaiting the next group session. That was when I noticed the first truly unsettling detail. A clipboard still resting on the nurse's station counter, a single yellowed page attached. I approached cautiously and shone my light on the paper. It contained a patient list with names, room numbers, and medication schedules. The date at the top read April 17th, 1997, just 3 days before the hospital's official closure. But what caught my attention was the handwritten note scrawled across the bottom of the page. "They're not leaving with US." A practical joke left by staff during the final days, I reasoned. Dark humor as a coping mechanism was common in high-stress medical environments. I photographed the clipboard and moved on, though the words lingered in my mind like an afterimage. The third floor held more specialized facilities. Treatment rooms with equipment still in place, a small surgical suite, hydrotherapy tubs like massive metal coffins with straps hanging from their sides, the remnants of restraint systems, leather cuffs attached to bed frames, padded isolation rooms with observation windows, hinted at West Haven's less enlightened approaches to psychiatric care. I was photographing one of the treatment rooms when the temperature plummeted. One moment I was sweating lightly under my jacket. The next I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The drop was so sudden and localized that I stepped backward instinctively, bumping into a metal cart that toppled with a crash that echoed like a gunshot. My heart hammering, I steadied myself against the wall, certain now that I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I called, my voice betraying my unease. Only silence answered, but as I aimed my flashlight toward the doorway, I noticed that the dust on the floor had been disturbed. A single line of footprints, not my own, led into the room and stopped abruptly in the center, as if someone had walked in and simply vanished. I should have left then. Any rational person would have. But I'd convinced myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps another photographer or inspector had been here recently. The footprints could be days old. The temperature change could be explained by some peculiarity of the building's ventilation system. I had a job to finish and a substantial payment waiting upon completion. So I continued upward to the fourth floor. Here, the decay was more pronounced. Water damage had warped the wooden floors, creating undulating patterns that made walking treacherous. Several ceiling sections had collapsed entirely, leaving piles of sodden plaster and exposed beams. The smell was worse too. The earlier medicinal scent now overwhelmed by mold and rot and something else. Something coppery and organic that reminded me of raw meat left too long in summer heat. I found myself moving more quickly, taking fewer photographs, eager to complete my documentation and leave before darkness fell. The light streaming through the windows had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon, and shadows were lengthening across the warped floors. It was in a large room at the end of the east wing, what appeared to have been a recreational area, that I found the graffiti. Unlike the typical tags or crude drawings one might expect, this was different. A massive mural covered the far wall, executed with surprising artistic skill. It depicted the hospital itself, rendered in black and deep crimson, but distorted, the windows transformed into screaming mouths, the walls seeming to bulge and warp as if the building were breathing. Figures, patients or staff, it was impossible to tell, were half embedded in the walls, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. Below the mural, written in the same crimson paint, at least, I hoped it was paint, the walls are thin here. They absorb, they remember, they hunger. A chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature ran through me. I raised my camera, more out of professional habit than any real desire to document this disturbing artwork, when a noise behind me froze me in place. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and dragging, approaching the open doorway. I turned slowly, flashlight extended like a weapon. The corridor beyond the door was empty, yet the footsteps continued, growing closer. I backed away until I hit the wall, my breathing shallow and rapid, camera clutched forgotten in my trembling hand. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway. Nothing appeared, but I could feel a presence there, a weight in the air, a density to the shadows that defied rational explanation. And then, a voice, barely above a whisper, raspy and wet, as if speaking through fluid. "Are you here for treatment?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My throat had closed up, every muscle locked in primal fear. After several heartbeats of silence, the presence seemed to recede, the weight lifting from the air. The footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor until they faded entirely. Minutes passed before I could move again. When I finally did, it was with a single imperative pounding through my mind. Get out. I'd abandoned the 5th floor entirely. I had more than enough material to satisfy my client. I turned toward the door, only to realize with dawning horror that it wasn't where it had been moments before. Where the doorway had stood was now solid wall, covered in peeling institutional green paint. Panic surged through me. I spun around, disoriented, searching for another exit. The room had changed subtly, the dimensions wrong, the ceiling lower, the mural on the wall altered. The figures were more distinct now, and one near the center looked disturbingly like me, face frozen in a silent scream. I pressed my hands against the wall where the door should have been, searching for seams, hinges, anything. The surface felt strangely warm and yielding beneath my fingertips, almost like skin stretched over muscle. I recoiled, while rising in my throat, and forced myself to think logically. I must have become disoriented. The door had to be here somewhere. As I moved along the wall, my flashlight beam caught something on the floor, a clipboard identical to the one I'd seen on the 2nd floor. Heart pounding, I approached and shone my light on the attached paper. My own name was at the top of the patient list, followed by today's date and a treatment schedule. Below it, the same handwritten note, "They're not leaving with US." The walls seemed to pulse around me, the faded green paint darkening in patches like spreading bruises. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. In the dimming light, I saw that the floor was moving, or rather, something beneath the floorboards was moving, causing the warped wood to rise and fall in a sick parody of breathing. A sound filled the room, distant at first, then growing louder. The collective moaning and whispering of countless voices, layered over one another until they formed a cacophony of misery. From within the walls, behind the peeling paint, pale shapes pressed outward, creating impressions of faces, hands, bodies, as if the walls themselves were composed of compressed human forms struggling to break free. My flashlight died completely. In the sudden darkness, I felt something brush against my cheek. Fingers, cold and damp, trailing across my skin with terrible tenderness. I screamed then, a raw sound torn from the depths of my being, and threw myself against where I thought the wall should be. By some miracle, I found a door. Not the one I'd entered through, but an exit nonetheless. I burst through into a corridor flooded with the deep orange light of the setting sun. Disoriented, gasping for breath, I realized I was now on the opposite side of the building, with no clear memory of how I traversed the distance. I ran. Down the corridor, searching frantically for stairs, my camera banging against my side, I found an emergency stairwell, its metal steps ringing hollow beneath my pounding feet. Down one flight, then another, the walls around me seeming to contract and expand with each footfall. On the landing between the second and first floors, I collided with something solid, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. I recoiled, raising my hands defensively, blinking against the gloom. It was a wheelchair, empty, facing the wall. It hadn't been there during my ascent. I was certain of that. As I edged past it, holding my breath, it rotated slowly toward me, though no one was there to turn it. The leather restraints attached to its arms and footrests were worn but intact, and dark stains discolored the seat cushion. I didn't wait to see more. I clattered down the remaining steps, burst through the exit door, and found myself in the main lobby, the massive front entrance visible across the checkered floor. Sunset painted the dust-filled air blood red, the final light of day streaming through the tall windows. 20 feet from freedom, I heard my name called, not spoken, but somehow projected directly into my mind. A chorus of voices, unified in their desperation. "Stay, we need you, we're so hungry." The floor beneath me softened, my shoes sinking into the marble as if it were quicksand. Looking down in horror, I saw the checkerboard pattern rippling, dark squares becoming pits that opened like hungry mouths. From within them, emaciated hands reached upward, grasping at my ankles. With a desperate lunge, I propelled myself forward, feeling fingers brush against my pant legs, tear at my shoelaces. I crashed against the front door, fumbling with the handle, my sweat-slick hands slipping on the brass. Behind me, the lobby transformed. The walls wept a thick, dark fluid that pooled on the floor and ran in rivulets toward me. The ceiling sagged downward like a bloated corpse, plaster cracking to reveal not wooden beams but something organic, pulsing vessels and glistening tissue. The very architecture of West Haven was revealing its true nature, shedding its disguise of brick and mortar. The door finally gave way beneath my weight. I tumbled onto the front steps as darkness fell completely, the last rays of sunlight vanishing behind distant hills. I didn't stop to look back, didn't pause to retrieve my fallen camera. I ran down the long driveway, legs pumping, lungs burning, the cool night air a blessed relief against my fevered skin. In my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely insert the key, I finally dared to look back at West Haven. It stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, windows like empty eyes staring down at me. For a moment, just a moment, the entire structure seemed to shift, to lean forward slightly, as if preparing to uproot itself and follow. I drove away, tires squealing on the asphalt, and didn't slow until I'd put 10 miles between myself and that place. That was 3 weeks ago. I told my client I'd been unable to complete the job due to unsafe conditions in the building. I forwarded the photographs I'd managed to take before my accident. A partial fall through rotted floorboards was my explanation, and returned half the payment. The images from my camera revealed nothing unusual. No mural, no clipboards with my name, no evidence of the horrors I'd experienced. Just empty rooms, peeling paint, broken furniture. All perfectly normal for an abandoned building. I've tried to convince myself that what happened was some kind of breakdown, stress, perhaps, or exposure to toxic mold spores causing hallucinations. A rational explanation for an irrational experience. But last night, I found something that shattered that comforting delusion. A manila envelope had been pushed under my apartment door. Inside was a single photograph, not one I had taken. It showed me, in the fourth-floor recreation room, standing before a blank wall where the mural should have been. My face was captured in profile, expression frozen in terror, eyes wide and mouth open in a silent scream. Behind me, visible only as a distortion in the air, a shape loomed, humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, limbs bent at impossible angles. The photograph's quality was poor, the image grainy and overexposed, but clear enough to see that whatever stood behind me was reaching out, elongated fingers inches from the back of my neck. Written on the back of the photograph, in handwriting I recognized from the clipboards, "Your treatment is incomplete. We're waiting. I haven't slept since finding it. Can't sleep. When I close my eyes, I see the walls of my apartment pulsing gently, hear whispers emanating from the heating vents. Twice now, I found my furniture rearranged while I was in another room. Subtle changes, a chair facing the wall, my dining table rotated 45 degrees. This morning, I noticed a stain on my bathroom wall. A damp patch of plaster that darkens and expands when I'm not looking directly at it. It reminds me of the map of West Haven, the sprawling layout of its connected wings and courtyards. Sometimes, I think I can hear breathing from within the wall, soft and labored, like a patient sedated but not quite unconscious. West Haven's scheduled demolition was canceled. The development company went bankrupt suddenly. Its CEO committed to a psychiatric facility after being found wandering the hospital grounds at night, raving about the thinness between. The building will remain standing indefinitely. I'm leaving tonight, abandoning my apartment, my possessions, this city, running as far as I can. But as I pack my essential belongings, a terrible certainty grows within me. Distance won't matter. West Haven found me once. It knows my name, my face, my scent. It's patient. It has absorbed countless souls over its long existence. What are a few more miles to a hunger so vast and ancient? Even now, as I write these words as both warning and confession, I can feel it reaching for me. The walls of my apartment seem more membrane than plaster, the corners of the room no longer meeting at right angles. The air thickens with each breath, filling my lungs with the same stagnant, medicinal scent I first encountered in that grand entrance hall. I wonder, sometimes, if I ever truly left West Haven at all. Perhaps my desperate flight was just another hallucination. Perhaps I remained trapped in that fourth-floor room, my mind creating this elaborate fantasy of escape as my body is slowly absorbed into the hungry walls. Or perhaps West Haven itself was never merely a building but something older, vaster. A patient predator that has worn many facades throughout the centuries, always feeding, always growing. The hospital was just its most recent incarnation, a perfect disguise. A place already filled with pain and fear and madness, where screams would raise no alarms and disappearances could be easily explained. I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment now, slow, dragging, the shuffle of hospital slippers on linoleum. A gentle knock at my door, though I know without looking that the corridor beyond is empty. Just the building itself, come to collect me for my overdue appointment. I won't answer, but eventually I'll have to sleep. And when I do, I know where I'll wake up. In a small room with a metal bed frame bolted to the floor, a cracked sink on the wall, and a window covered with a heavy grate. My name will be on the clipboard hanging outside the door, my treatment schedule carefully noted. And the walls, oh, the walls will welcome me home, softening to receive me, to absorb me into their hungry embrace. I'll become part of West Haven, as so many have before me. Another voice in the chorus that whispers from behind peeling paint. Another pair of eyes staring out from within the membrane, watching for the next visitor who comes to document the empty rooms. Because the rooms are never truly empty, and the walls are so very, very thin.